My name is Sarah Myers. I am 31 years old and a forensic accountant living in Chicago. They say family is supposed to be your safe harbor. But sometimes blind family loyalty becomes a noose around your own neck, and you do not realize you are choking until the floor drops out from under you. My sister carried $5 million in untraceable bonds into our parents' house to save our family from total ruin. Then a masked robber stepped from the shadows and whispered, "Not to scream." When I heard that familiar voice, I realized the robbery was just a distraction. The real betrayal was already happening right in front of me. Before I tell you whose voice was behind that mask and how I turned their perfect crime into a federal trap, please take a moment to like and subscribe if you believe that the truth always comes out. Also drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to how I ended up hiding behind a kitchen island while a $2 million debt hung over my head. My parents, Richard and Sandra, ran a traditional construction company here in Illinois. Growing up, I was always the responsible one in the background. I was the quiet girl who stayed out of trouble, got good grades, and eventually built a solid career in forensic accounting. I spent my days tracking missing money, exposing tax evasion, and untangling corporate fraud for large firms. My younger sister Claire, on the other hand, was the undeniable golden child. She was beautiful, charismatic, and completely shielded from any real responsibility. Whatever Claire wanted, Claire got. Whatever financial mess she made, our parents quietly cleaned it up. But while they were busy funding Claire and ignoring the changing economy, their construction company was bleeding cash. By the time I turned 30, the business was drowning in $2 million of toxic debt. Suppliers were suing them. Contractors were walking off job sites. The bank was threatening to seize everything they owned. That is when my mother came to my apartment unannounced. She sat on my living room couch and wept into her hands, telling me that they were going to lose the family business, the house, and their entire retirement. She looked at me with tears streaming down her face and told me I was their only hope. Driven by a misplaced sense of daughterly duty and a crushing amount of guilt, I made the absolute biggest mistake of my life. I used my pristine credit score to co-sign their consolidated business loans. I put my modest 3-bedroom home and my entire 401k retirement fund on the line to save them. I told myself it was just temporary. They were my parents. You do not let your family drown when you have a life raft. I deliberately ignored every single red flag my accounting background gave me because you desperately want to believe your parents have a plan. You want to believe they will protect you the way you are protecting them. For a few agonizing months, things seemed stable. I transferred my entire savings to keep the minimum bank payments afloat while my parents promised me a massive turnaround was just over the horizon. I was barely sleeping. I was working 60-hour weeks at my firm just to make sure I could cover my own mortgage and their business loan minimums. Every time my phone rang, I felt sick to my stomach thinking it was a debt collector. Then came the ray of hope that was supposed to save us all. My late grandfather had left a sprawling suburban estate to my father. It was a beautiful historic property that had been in the family for decades. For years, my father had adamantly refused to sell it purely out of stubborn pride. But with the bank breathing down our necks and my credit stretched to the absolute breaking point, he finally caved. They found a private buyer willing to pay $5 million for the estate. Because the buyer was an eccentric overseas investor, the transaction was highly unusual. The payment was to be made entirely in certified cashier checks and untraceable bearer bonds. As a forensic accountant, the alarm bells in my head were deafening. Bearer bonds are essentially pure physical cash. Whoever physically holds the paper legally owns the money. I warned my father how dangerous it was to handle that kind of untraceable wealth outside of a secure wire transfer. I told him we needed armed security and an immediate secure deposit at our primary bank the very second the deal closed. My mother just waved off my concerns with a dismissive flick of her wrist. She told me I was being overly dramatic and that I needed to stop treating my own family like one of my corporate fraud suspects. She said this $5 million would wipe out the $2 million debt completely save my house from the bank, and leave them with a comfortable $3 million retirement fund. I finally breathed a massive sigh of relief. I mapped out the spreadsheets in my head, calculating the exact day my name would be removed from those suffocating loan documents. I thought the nightmare was finally over. I thought I was going to get my life and my future back. We arranged for the exchange to happen on a Friday evening. My parents decided that Claire would be the one to transport the briefcase from the private lawyer's office to our parents' house. They said Claire was less conspicuous than my father, and that no one would suspect a 28-year-old woman carrying a simple silver case. I thought it was a terrible and reckless idea, but I was just so completely exhausted from carrying their financial burden that I did not have the energy to fight it anymore. I just wanted the debt paid and my name cleared. I drove over to my parents' house that evening to wait for Claire to arrive. The sky was getting dark, and a heavy storm was rolling in over the suburbs. I was sitting at the kitchen island drinking a glass of water when the front door finally unlocked. Claire walked in holding the heavy silver briefcase against her chest. She looked triumphant and relieved. My parents rushed forward to hug her, celebrating the end of our financial ruin. For one single second, I actually felt happy. I felt the crushing weight of the $2 million debt begin to lift off my shoulders. Then the power to the entire house was completely cut. The room plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. Before anyone could even scream, the back door was kicked open with a sickening crash, and everything I thought I knew about my family shattered into pieces. My mother insisted we celebrate the transaction with a family dinner. I arrived at the house in the early evening, my stomach tied in tight, agonizing knots. The rain was lashing aggressively against the dining room windows, adding a gloomy chill to the otherwise warm suburban house. Sandra was buzzing around the kitchen arranging a platter of roast beef and potatoes, while my father paced the living room carpet checking his watch every 2 minutes. He had poured himself a heavy glass of bourbon, the ice clinking loudly in the quiet space. Claire was running late. She was supposed to drive straight from the private attorney's office downtown. The plan they devised was simple but incredibly foolish in my eyes. She was bringing the briefcase containing the cashier checks and bearer bonds directly to the house, so my father could lock it in his floor safe overnight before heading to our main bank branch first thing the next morning. Every single instinct I had developed as a forensic accountant screamed against this protocol. $5 million sitting in a residential home was an absolute recipe for disaster. But Sandra had snapped at me to stop being a paranoid buzzkill, so I kept my mouth shut and focused on the fact that my suffocating debt was finally about to vanish. When the heavy oak front door finally swung open, the collective exhale in the room was palpable. Claire stepped into the foyer, shaking the rain from her expensive designer trench coat. She looked flawless as always, but she was clutching a sleek silver case tightly against her chest. Her knuckles were stark white. My father practically sprinted to her, taking the case and setting it gently on the center of the mahogany dining table. It sat there like a holy relic. $5 million. The ultimate end to our daily nightmares. Sandra pulled Claire into a tight, dramatic hug, praising her bravery and her dedication to the family. I stood near the kitchen island feeling a strange mixture of profound relief and lingering anxiety. We were saved. I was going to be saved. The $2 million noose around my neck was going to be cut loose by Monday morning. Then in an absolute instant, the world went completely black. The power cut out with a heavy vibrating thud, plunging the entire house into suffocating darkness. The violent storm outside suddenly seemed to roar far louder against the glass. Sandra let out a startled, high-pitched shriek. My father muttered a frustrated curse, fumbling in his pockets for his cell phone flashlight. I took a step toward the utility drawer to grab an emergency lantern, my mind briefly assuming the heavy winds had simply knocked out a local neighborhood transformer. Before anyone could even flick on a phone light, the heavy wooden back door leading to the patio was violently kicked open. The sound was absolutely deafening. It was a brutal crack of splintering wood and shattering glass that echoed through the pitch-black house. A sudden gust of freezing rain and wind swept through the kitchen, carrying the smell of wet asphalt. Pure primal terror seized my body. My knees buckled on pure instinct, and I dove hard behind the heavy granite kitchen island. I pressed my back tight against the cold wooden cabinets, my hands desperately covering my mouth to stifle the scream that was rising in my throat. Through the narrow gap between the island and the stainless steel refrigerator, I could see a towering silhouette illuminated only by the faint, eerie glow of a street lamp filtering through the rain-streaked windows. It was a man dressed entirely in black, wearing a heavy dark ski mask over his face. Water dripped rapidly from his heavy jacket. He moved with a terrifying, practiced purpose, stepping straight over the shattered doorframe and into our kitchen. Sandra screamed again, a raw, guttural sound of pure panic that was abruptly cut off. As the man raised his right arm, even in the dim lighting, the metallic gleam of a handgun was completely unmistakable. He pointed it directly at my father's chest. My father immediately threw his trembling hands high into the air, backing away from the dining table. He looked completely paralyzed, his earlier confident bravado vanishing in a single terrifying instant. My heart hammered against my ribs so violently, I thought the intruder would hear it beating from across the room. I was trembling uncontrollably, praying that the dark shadows hiding me were deep enough to keep me concealed. The masked man did not demand our wallets or my mother's jewelry. He did not ask for the floor-safe combination. He moved with a chilling familiarity, completely bypassing the expensive silver candlesticks on the dining room sideboard. He walked straight toward the dining table. He walked straight toward the silver briefcase. Claire was standing right next to the table, frozen like a statue. The man stepped right up to her, closing the distance until he was mere inches away from her face. He kept the dark gun leveled steadily at my parents, but his body was angled entirely toward my sister. He reached out with his free hand and firmly grabbed the handle of the briefcase. I held my breath, waiting for Claire to panic, waiting for her to fight back or plead for her life. Instead, she just let go. She let him take the heavy case without a single ounce of resistance or struggle. The man leaned in dangerously close to her face. The room was dead silent, except for the howling wind pushing through the broken door. And in that terrifying, hushed quiet, I heard him speak. His voice was low, barely above a rough whisper, but the acoustics of the dining room carried the sound directly to where I was hiding on the floor. He said, "Do not scream, Claire." The words hit me with the physical force of a brutal punch to the stomach. The air completely rushed out of my lungs. My mind scrambled, trying desperately to process the auditory input because my brain fundamentally rejected what I had just heard. I knew that exact voice. I knew the precise cadence, the subtle familiar rasp, the specific inflection of those words. I had heard that exact voice laughing warmly at our family barbecues. I had heard that voice proposing a cheerful toast at a holiday dinner just 2 months ago. It was Brad, my sister's fiancé. A sickening wave of intense nausea washed over me. This was not a random neighborhood home invasion. The man holding a deadly weapon in my parents' living room, the man currently turning to walk out the back door with $5 million in untraceable assets, was the man my sister was actively planning to marry. He knew her name. He told her not to scream. And she had handed over the briefcase as if they were running through a carefully rehearsed stage play. Before I could fully process the absolute magnitude of this betrayal, before I could even push myself up from the cold kitchen tiles to shout his name, the piercing wail of police sirens suddenly ripped through the rainy night air. They were incredibly close. Someone must have triggered a silent panic alarm, or a neighbor had heard the door smash. The flashing red and blue lights began to slice frantically through the rain outside, casting chaotic shadows across the living room walls. The masked man darted out into the raging storm, vanishing entirely into the darkness with my financial freedom in his hand. As the sirens grew deafening, my family began to wail and cry for help, performing their perfect roles. I stayed crouched silently behind the kitchen island, realizing with terrifying clarity that the robbery was just an elaborate prop. The real nightmare was the sickening, twisted charade my family was about to perform, and I was the only person not in on the script. The flashing blue and red lights cut violently through the heavy rain, turning our shattered kitchen into a chaotic crime scene. Within minutes, multiple squad cars had swarmed the driveway. Uniformed officers poured through the broken back door, their heavy flashlights sweeping across the dark corners of the property, while a tactical unit cleared the upstairs rooms. The storm was still raging outside, blowing wet leaves and freezing wind across the hardwood floor, but the deep chill creeping up my spine had absolutely nothing to do with the weather. We were ushered into the formal living room by a pair of responding officers. My father collapsed heavily onto the leather sofa, burying his face in his hands while my mother hovered frantically over Claire. A senior detective with graying hair and a damp trench coat walked into the room to take our official statements. He introduced himself as Detective Lawson. He held a small notepad and spoke with a calm, soothing tone, clearly trying to de-escalate the raw panic in the room. He started the interview with Claire. What followed was an absolute masterclass in theatrical manipulation. My sister pulled a thick-knitted throw blanket tightly around her trembling shoulders and buried her face against my mother's chest. She let out these loud, ragged, breathless sobs that sounded incredibly convincing. She told the detective that a massive, terrifying stranger had ambushed her out of nowhere. She claimed the man shoved the barrel of his gun right against her forehead and swore he would empty the magazine into our parents if she did not hand over the briefcase instantly. I stood silently against the far wall watching her perform this sickening charade. There were no actual tears falling from her eyes when she finally looked up, just a wide-eyed expression of manufactured trauma. She painted a vivid picture of a ruthless, unknown assailant, making up elaborate details about his towering height and his aggressive posture. My parents bought every single word of her story without hesitation. My father kept repeating that she was an absolute hero for keeping them alive during a deadly home invasion. My mother stroked Claire's blonde hair, cooing softly and telling the detective that her youngest daughter was entirely too fragile to endure this kind of violent, traumatic interrogation. Detective Lawson patiently jotted down her fabricated details before turning his attention to me. He asked where I was located during the breach. I stepped away from the wall and crossed the living room, feeling the sudden intense weight of my family's gaze burning into my skin. I looked directly at the detective and told him I was hiding behind the kitchen island. I explained that the shadows concealed me completely, but I had a clear, unobstructed line of sight to the dining table. I took a deep breath, steadying my racing heart because I knew exactly what my next words would trigger in that room. I told the detective that the man did not threaten to kill anyone. I told him the intruder did not shove a gun against her forehead or demand the money with violence. He simply reached out, and Claire willingly handed the briefcase over like it was a scheduled delivery. My father snapped his head up from his hands, staring at me in total bewilderment. Claire let out a sharp, dramatic gasp, pressing her hand to her chest, as if I had just physically struck her across the face. But I did not stop speaking. I looked Detective Lawson dead in the eye and delivered the final blow. I told him the man leaned in and whispered for her not to scream. And I told him without a single shadow of a doubt that the familiar voice belonged to Brad. I stated clearly and firmly that her own fiancé had orchestrated the entire robbery. The reaction from my family was instantaneous and violently explosive. My mother did not just object, she absolutely erupted. She lunged forward, pointing a shaking manicured finger directly at my face. She screamed at the detective not to listen to a single word I was saying. The sheer venom in her voice was so thick it practically choked all the air out of the room. She shrieked that I was a delusional, paranoid liar, making up sick fantasies for attention. She spun around to face the officers and declared that I had always been bitterly jealous of my younger sister. She told the police that I was intentionally trying to ruin Claire's upcoming wedding because my own life was such a miserable, lonely failure. Sandra did not stop there. She paced the living room floor, waving her hands frantically as she spun a sickening narrative to entirely discredit me. She claimed the immense stress of our family business failing had completely broken my mind. She told them I was drowning in extreme financial anxiety because I had co-signed their business loans and that my desperate panic was making me hallucinate wild conspiracy theories just to blame an innocent man. She turned to me with a look of such absolute unmasked disgust it made my stomach turn. She told the room I was a toxic, bitter spinster, who could not stand to see Claire happy and wealthy while I sat in my empty house balancing spreadsheets every night. My father chimed in right on cue, shaking his head with an expression of profound disappointment. He apologized to the detective for my behavior, claiming I had a long history of making up dramatic lies whenever I felt overshadowed by my sister. Claire buried her face back into the blanket, letting out loud, breathless wails, acting as though my vicious accusation had broken her fragile heart entirely. They built a unified, impenetrable wall of deception right in front of my eyes, painting me as the unstable, jealous older sister who was cracking under the pressure of severe debt. I desperately tried to defend myself. I begged Detective Lawson to check Brad's phone records, to pull the neighborhood security cameras, and to look at the undeniable timing of the power cut. I explained my background as a forensic accountant, pleading with him to look at the financial logic of a targeted hit on untraceable bearer bonds. But I could see the exact moment the police stopped taking me seriously. The officers in the room exchanged tired, knowing glances. Detective Lawson slowly closed his notepad. His initial professional urgency completely morphed into polite, uncomfortable pity. He told my parents they would file a standard report for a residential home invasion and coordinate with the bank regarding the stolen assets. He completely ignored my demand to investigate Brad. In the eyes of local law enforcement, this was no longer a complex, high-stakes financial heist. Thanks to my mother's vicious character assassination, the situation had been successfully downgraded to a petty, pathetic family dispute. They viewed me as nothing more than a stressed-out, hysterical woman lashing out at her perfect younger sister. As the detectives packed up their gear and walked out the front door, leaving me completely isolated with the very people who had just thrown me to the wolves, I realized how brilliantly they had set their trap. They had neutralized my voice completely, and the worst was yet to come. The morning sun crawled through my bedroom blinds, bringing absolutely no warmth to the freezing reality of my life. I had barely slept a single minute. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the smug, terrifying look on my mother's face as she systematically destroyed my credibility in front of the police. I sat on the edge of my mattress, clutching a cold cup of coffee, trying to rationalize the irrational. Families fight. Families have favorites. But they do not invent a psychological breakdown to silence their own daughter. At exactly 8:30, the sharp ring of my cell phone shattered the dead quiet of my apartment. It was not my mother calling to apologize. It was a restricted number. I answered the phone with a dry, scratchy throat, expecting a follow-up call from a police detective. Instead, the voice on the other end belonged to a senior account manager from my primary lending institution. He did not offer a polite morning greeting or ask how I was doing. His tone was clipped strictly professional and laced with a heavy urgency that immediately made the blood drain from my face. He asked if I was aware of the emergency legal filings submitted to the federal bankruptcy court at the crack of dawn. I told him I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. My mind was completely blank. What he said next knocked the remaining breath completely out of my lungs. My parents, Richard and Sandra Myers, had officially filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, the exact moment the courthouse doors opened. My brain scrambled desperately to keep up with the catastrophic scale of that revelation. Chapter 7. Bankruptcy is never a simple paperwork error or a spontaneous decision. It requires meticulous legal preparation, extensive financial disclosures, and hours of strategic maneuvering by a team of lawyers. You do not just wake up the morning after a terrifying home invasion and spontaneously file for total corporate and personal insolvency before you even eat breakfast. The thick stack of legal paperwork had to have been drawn up entirely in advance. They had walked into that federal courthouse claiming they were utterly destitute and completely ruined. They used the fresh police report from the staged robbery just hours earlier as their ultimate trump card. They declared to a federal judge under oath that $5 million in bearer bonds had been violently stolen from their property, leaving the construction company completely incapable of covering a single cent of its mounting liabilities. The bank manager was not calling to offer his sympathies for my family tragedy. He was calling to inform me of the immediate devastating consequences. Because my parents had legally shielded themselves under the absolute protection of a federal bankruptcy judge, Their angry creditors could no longer touch them. The debt collectors could not call their phones or seize their remaining personal property. But the bank still needed its money, and my signature was sitting right there on the bottom line of the original consolidated business loan. I was the primary co-signer. In a matter of seconds, the entire $2 million debt bypassed my parents completely and defaulted directly onto my shoulders. Every single liability they had racked up through years of reckless spending, bad business deals, and lavish living was now my sole legal responsibility. The room literally started to spin around me. My hands shook so violently, I had to press the phone hard against my ear. I asked the manager what this meant for my personal assets and my future. He informed me with chilling clinical detachment that my accounts were already being flagged across their internal systems. Because the massive business debt vastly exceeded my liquid cash savings, the bank was immediately executing their legal right to claim my collateral. My beautiful, modest 3-bedroom home, the sanctuary I had worked grueling 60-hour weeks to purchase, the only safe space I had left in the world, was officially being placed on the pre-foreclosure list. A formal legal notice of default was already being drafted by their legal department and would be publicly taped to my front door within days. They were also moving to freeze and seize my 401k retirement fund. 15 years of my meticulous saving, my late nights auditing corporate fraud. My careful financial planning was being eradicated in a single morning. I dropped the phone onto the bed. The plastic casing made a dull, hollow thud against the mattress. I stared blankly at the beige bedroom wall as the horrific pieces of the puzzle finally snapped into perfect, agonizing clarity. The robbery had never been about simply stealing the $5 million from the grandfather estate. Stealing the money was only half the plan. The real genius of their sickening scheme was finding a flawless way to dump their toxic construction company debt without facing the legal consequences. They needed a catastrophic event to justify an immediate emergency bankruptcy to the federal courts. And they needed a naive, loyal scapegoat to catch the massive financial grenade when it finally detonated. I was the scapegoat. I had always been the scapegoat. My mother weeping on my couch weeks ago, insisting I co-sign the loan under the guise of family survival, was never a genuine, desperate plea for help. It was a cold, calculated trap. They had groomed me for that exact signature, knowing full well that when the ship finally sank, they would comfortably float away in a lifeboat padded with $5 million in untraceable cash. Meanwhile, I would be left chained to the heavy iron anchor, plunging straight to the bottom of the ocean. My own flesh and blood, the very people who raised me, had looked me right in the eyes and smiled while slipping a financial noose directly around my neck. A freezing, numbing shock washed over my entire body. I was 31 years old, facing $2 million in unpayable debt, total financial ruin, and the imminent loss of my beloved home. My golden child sister Claire was currently sitting on a mountain of untraceable wealth with the exact man who held a gun in my parents' living room. Most people would have completely shattered into a million pieces in that exact moment. Most people would have curled up on the floor and surrendered to the devastating cruelty of their own parents. I let the hot tears fall down my face for exactly 5 minutes. I let myself mourn the family I thought I had and the parents I desperately wanted to believe in. But when those 5 minutes were up, I wiped my face. The sorrow evaporated into the morning air, leaving nothing behind but pure, hyper-focused rage. They thought because I was the quiet, responsible daughter, I would just silently accept my absolute destruction. They assumed I would simply cry and carry their burden like I always did. They had completely forgotten what I did for a living. I was a forensic accountant. I hunted professional liars for a living. I tracked hidden assets, unraveled complex fraud, and destroyed financial criminals every single day. And my parents had just given me the ultimate reason to hunt them down. The heavy mahogany door of my parents' house slammed shut behind me with a final echoing thud. I stood alone on the wet porch, shivering in the freezing rain, while the reality of my absolute banishment sank into my bones. My mother had not just kicked me out. She had expertly excommunicated me from the entire family tree. By the time I drove back to my own house and tried calling my Aunt Susan and Uncle Robert, the well had already been thoroughly poisoned. My calls went straight to voicemail. The one cousin who actually answered the phone told me with absolute disgust that I needed serious psychiatric help for accusing Claire and her fiancé of staging an armed robbery. Sandra had spun her web with terrifying speed. In the eyes of everyone I had ever known, I was now the unhinged, desperately jealous older sister who had cracked under the pressure of financial stress and tried to destroy her siblings happily ever after. I was completely radioactive. I walked into my quiet living room and sank onto the sofa without even taking off my damp coat. My house felt different now. It no longer felt like the sanctuary I had worked so hard to buy. It felt like a ticking time bomb. The bank would be taping a foreclosure notice to my front window any day now. I sat in the suffocating silence and let the chaotic events of the past 24 hours play backward in my mind. I needed to strip away the intense emotional trauma and look at the raw mechanics of what had actually happened. The masked man kicking the door, the immediate surrender of the silver briefcase, the absolute lack of resistance from Claire, the whispered command not to scream in a voice I knew as well as my own. It was a brilliantly executed stage play. Claire and Brad had walked away with $5 million in untraceable bearer bonds and cashier checks. But the more I stared at the blank wall of my living room, the more a massive glaring inconsistency began to gnaw at the back of my mind. The robbery explained where the money went, but it absolutely did not explain the bankruptcy. You cannot walk into a federal courthouse and file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy on a spontaneous whim. The sheer volume of legal documentation, the itemized asset declarations, the creditor schedules, and the attorney briefings take weeks of meticulous preparation. Even if my parents were devastated by the loss of the money, it was logistically impossible for them to file those massive bankruptcy petitions the very next morning at the stroke of 8, unless the paperwork had been drawn up long before the masked man ever kicked in our back door. A terrifying shiver ran down my spine. The robbery was not the cause of the bankruptcy. The robbery was the alibi. My tears stopped completely. The crushing, suffocating grief of being discarded by my own parents suddenly evaporated, and a cold, sharp clarity took its place. I wiped my face and stood up from the sofa. They had made a fatal miscalculation. They had relied on my loyalty and my emotional vulnerability, assuming I would just fold under the immense weight of the $2 million debt and quietly disappear into ruin. They forgot who they were dealing with. I was not just a naive, obedient daughter. I was a senior forensic accountant. I spent 40 hours a week dismantling corporate fraud, tracing offshore accounts, and destroying white-collar criminals. My parents had just handed me the ultimate puzzle, and I was going to rip it to shreds. I walked straight to my home office and booted up my laptop. My fingers flew across the keyboard with a frantic but heavily practiced precision. If my parents had orchestrated a premeditated bankruptcy, the evidence would be hiding in plain sight, buried deep within public financial records and state registries. Fraud always leaves a paper trail. You just have to know exactly where to look. I bypassed the private bank accounts and went straight for the state corporate filings, pulling up the operating history of my parents' construction company. I downloaded months of public tax records, lien registrations, and vendor dispute filings. For 6 straight hours, I sat glued to my screen, cross-referencing every single transaction, equipment sale, and property transfer they had made over the past year. What I found made my blood run absolutely cold. The narrative my mother had fed me weeping on my couch about a sudden economic downturn, bankrupting the family business, was a complete and total fabrication. The company had not been struggling to survive. It had been intentionally bled dry. Starting 8 months ago, my father had begun systematically liquidating every single valuable asset the business owned. He had quietly sold off their fleet of heavy construction machinery to a buyer down in Texas. He had liquidated their commercial warehouse spaces and transferred the property titles to a newly formed limited liability company registered in Delaware. They had stripped the traditional family business down to a hollow, worthless shell. Then, they had deliberately stopped paying their suppliers and contractors, allowing the corporate debt to balloon into a massive, unmanageable $2 million crisis. They needed the debt to grow large enough to justify a total collapse, and they needed a trusting fool with a pristine credit score to co-sign those liabilities so the bank would not look too closely at their vanishing collateral. The $5 million estate sale was never meant to save the company. The company was already a rotting corpse by design. The entire timeline stretched out in front of my eyes with sickening perfection. The asset stripping the massive ballooning debt, the perfectly timed estate sale, the staged robbery, and the miraculously prepared bankruptcy filings. It was not a desperate reaction to a tragic crime. It was a highly sophisticated long con designed to steal $5 million tax-free abandon, $2 million in debt onto my shoulders, and walk away totally scot-free. I leaned back in my desk chair, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes. The sheer scale of their cruelty was breathtaking. They had orchestrated my total financial destruction with the calculated precision of professional grifters. But they had left an electronic footprint a mile wide. My parents thought they had buried me alive, but they had only given me the exact map I needed to destroy them. The game was no longer about surviving their betrayal. It was about gathering the ironclad proof required to burn their perfect crime straight to the ground. The heavy silence of my living room was abruptly broken by the sharp, harsh chime of the doorbell. It was past 11 at night. The fierce storm from the previous evening had passed, leaving a damp, bitter chill hanging in the air. I had spent the last 8 hours staring at spreadsheets and public records, slowly unearthing the massive financial conspiracy my own parents had built to destroy me. My eyes were burning from the glow of the computer monitor, and my nerves were frayed to the absolute limit. I walked slowly toward the front door, my bare feet making no sound against the hardwood floor. I checked the security peephole. Standing on my front porch, bathed in the harsh yellow light of the street lamp, was Brad. My sister's fiancé looked entirely different from the man who usually attended our family dinners. The warm, easygoing smile he constantly wore was completely gone. His posture was rigid, and his eyes were dark and calculating. A deep, primal instinct screamed at me to keep the door locked and walk away. But I also knew that running from a predator only makes them realize you are weak. I took a deep, steadying breath, unfastened the deadbolt, and pulled the door open just enough to face him. He did not offer a polite greeting. He simply pushed his hand against the heavy wooden door, forcing it open wider, and stepped right into my foyer. He closed the door behind himself with a quiet, deliberate click that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up. I demanded to know what he was doing in my house. I kept my voice steady, refusing to let him see the sheer panic vibrating through my chest. Brad slowly shoved his hands into the pockets of his expensive dark wool coat. He looked around my modest home with an expression of intense disgust before his cold gaze finally locked onto mine. He told me he was here to offer some friendly family advice. His voice was smooth and perfectly controlled, but it lacked any trace of the charming future brother-in-law persona he had perfected over the past 2 years. He said I needed to stop talking to the police. He said my hysterical accusations at the precinct were becoming very tiresome for everyone involved. He took a slow step closer, invading my personal space. The scent of expensive cologne and damp wool filled the narrow hallway. He told me that my parents were already dealing with the heartbreaking trauma of a violent home invasion and the devastating loss of their family business. He warned me that if I kept pushing this absurd theory about him wearing a mask and staging a robbery, things were going to get incredibly complicated for me. I stared right back at him and told him I knew everything. I told him I knew the company had been stripped of its assets months ago. I told him I knew the bankruptcy was completely premeditated and that the stolen $5 million was nothing but a smokescreen to abandon the $2 million debt onto my shoulders. Brad did not flinch. He did not look surprised or defensive. Instead, a slow, chilling smirk spread across his face. He tilted his head slightly and told me I had a very vivid imagination. Then his tone dropped into a low, dangerous whisper. He asked me if I really thought the police were going to believe a desperate woman drowning in debt over a terrified family who had just lost everything. He took another step forward, trapping me against the entryway console table. He laid out a terrifying hypothetical scenario right in front of me. He said the police were currently looking very closely for an inside informant. They knew a perfectly timed heist of untraceable bearer bonds required someone with intimate knowledge of the transaction. Someone who knew exactly when the money would arrive. Someone with a massive, undeniable motive to make sure those funds vanished so the company would collapse and the debt would be wiped out. He looked at me with dead shark-like eyes. He pointed out that I was a forensic accountant. I knew exactly how to move money. I knew exactly how to manipulate financial records. I had a $2 million noose around my neck and a pristine professional background that would make a perfect cover for a criminal mastermind. Brad leaned in so close I could feel the cold dampness radiating from his coat. He whispered that it would be incredibly tragic if the police suddenly received an anonymous tip. It would be devastating if investigators found a prepaid burner phone buried in my backyard trash cans, containing text messages coordinating a staged hit. He smiled a sick, twisted smile and said the local prosecutors would love a high-profile case about a greedy corporate accountant who hired a thug to terrorize her own family just to escape a bad business loan. The sheer audacity of his threat knocked the wind completely out of my lungs. I realized in that horrifying moment that they had thought 10 steps ahead of me. They were not just content with taking my money and ruining my credit. They had built a perfectly constructed backup plan to frame me for a federal crime if I ever got too close to the truth. They were actively prepared to send me to a federal penitentiary to protect their stolen $5 million. Brad backed away, smoothing the lapels of his coat with absolute arrogant calm. He told me to pack my things, accept the foreclosure, and walk away quietly. He advised me to consider it a tough life lesson. Then he turned around, opened the front door, and walked out into the freezing night, leaving me completely paralyzed in the silent foyer. I locked the door and slid the deadbolt into place with trembling fingers. My entire body was shaking, but it was no longer from fear. It was a violent, explosive realization of exactly what was at stake. I was not just fighting to save my 3-bedroom house anymore. I was not just fighting to clear a massive fraudulent debt from my credit report. I was actively fighting for my freedom. If I went to the authorities with nothing but theories and public records, Brad and my parents would completely destroy my life. They would plant the evidence. They would play the victims. I would lose my professional license, my home, and years of my life behind bars. I walked back into my home office and looked at the glowing computer screen displaying my parents' empty corporate tax returns. I could not just rely on circumstantial connections. I needed an undeniable ironclad weapon. I needed audio recordings. I needed offshore account routing numbers. I needed concrete proof that would completely obliterate their false narrative before they could spring their trap on me. The game had just escalated from a cruel family betrayal to a deadly fight for survival, and I knew exactly what I had to do next. The drive to the specialized electronics store in downtown Chicago felt like a blur of sheer adrenaline and terrifying clarity. Swallowing my pride was without a doubt the most bitter, agonizing pill I have ever had to force down my throat. For my entire 31 years on this earth, I had strived to be the perfect, reliable daughter, the one who never caused trouble, and quietly fixed every single disaster. Now I had to weaponize that exact submissive persona against the very people who had created it. I walked into the shop and purchased a high-definition microcamera using a prepaid debit card to ensure the transaction could never be traced back to me. It was an incredibly sophisticated piece of technology, no bigger than a standard postage stamp. It was fully equipped with motion activation, an extended lithium battery life, and a continuous cellular uplink that would broadcast directly to an encrypted server. As a forensic accountant, I knew the psychology of financial criminals intimately. They always eventually get comfortable. They inevitably let their guard down in the spaces where they feel most powerful. And for my father, that undisputed safe harbor was his private home office. Approaching my parents' suburban house felt remarkably like marching toward my own execution. My knuckles were bone white against the steering wheel as I parked on the pristine concrete driveway. I took a long, deep breath, trying desperately to slow the frantic hammering of my heart. I had to step into the role of the broken, hysterical woman they had so ruthlessly painted me out to be. I needed them to believe with absolute certainty that the crushing weight of the $2 million debt had completely shattered my spirit. I forced my eyes to well up with hot tears, practicing a trembling lower lip and a deeply defeated slump of my shoulders before I finally stepped onto the porch and rang the doorbell. My mother opened the door wearing a crisp beige cardigan and a look of absolute undisguised disdain. She did not step aside to invite me inside. She simply stood squarely in the doorway, blocking the entrance like a highly trained guard dog, anticipating an attack. I immediately launched into the most pathetic, humiliating apology of my entire life. I let the tears spill freely down my cheeks, sobbing that I was so incredibly sorry for my completely irrational behavior during the robbery. I told her that the sheer panic of the incoming bank foreclosure notices had caused me to suffer a severe nervous breakdown. I begged for her forgiveness, claiming I was just a desperate, jealous mess who had hallucinated the entire conspiracy about Brad out of pure, unadulterated fear. The transformation on her face was profoundly sickening to witness. The cold, rigid hostility instantly melted into a smug, triumphant satisfaction. Sandra absolutely thrived on total submission. Seeing her eldest daughter completely broken standing on her porch, begging for worthless scraps of mercy, fed her massive narcissism perfectly. She let out a long, dramatic sigh, adjusting her perfectly styled hair with an air of immense superiority. She told me she always knew I would eventually come to my senses once the ridiculous hysteria wore off. She finally stepped aside and allowed me into the foyer, but she made sure to sharply remind me that repairing the terrible damage I had done to our family reputation would take a very long time. I kept my head bowed, staring submissively at the polished hardwood floor. I told her I understood completely, and that I was willing to do whatever it took to make amends. Then I delivered the hook. I explained that the bank was moving forward with the eviction process much faster than I had anticipated. I told her I would be losing my house by the end of the month and moving into a tiny, cramped studio apartment on the other side of town. I asked in my most fragile, trembling voice if I could please just gather a few boxes of my childhood keepsakes and old photo albums before I lost everything I had left in the world. I specifically mentioned that my favorite albums were tucked away in the storage closet attached to my father's private study. Sandra crossed her arms and checked her gold wristwatch. She told me to be quick because she was expecting an important phone call from the bankruptcy lawyers in a few minutes. She pointed me toward the hallway and then walked into the kitchen to pour herself a fresh cup of coffee, leaving me unescorted for what I knew would be exactly 3 to 4 minutes. That was absolutely all the time I needed. I hurried down the carpeted hall, my soft rubber-soled shoes, making absolutely no sound. I slipped past the formal living room and pushed open the heavy mahogany door of my father's private office. The room smelled strongly of expensive leather and stale tobacco. This was the undisputed command center where my parents and Brad had undoubtedly plotted my total financial execution. The massive oak desk was meticulously clean-swept, entirely clear of any incriminating financial documents or ledgers. They were far too smart to leave paper trails lying around in the open. But I was not looking for paper. My eyes immediately locked onto the tall cylindrical air purifier humming quietly in the far corner of the room. It was positioned perfectly. It offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the entire office, including the leather seating area and the massive computer monitor on my father's desk. I moved silently across the plush carpet, pulling the tiny micro camera from my coat pocket. My hands were shaking so badly I had to clench my jaw to force them steady. If my mother walked in right now, the entire game would be completely over. The horrifying threat Brad had delivered to me in the dead of night would become my permanent reality. I knelt down beside the air purifier, carefully popping off the plastic front grille. I nestled the tiny black lens deep inside the dark slatted vents, hiding it perfectly within the internal shadows of the machine. I quickly secured it with a strip of heavy-duty adhesive routing the microscopic antenna along the interior plastic housing, so it would not block the air filter or draw any suspicion. I powered the device on. A tiny blue light blinked once, and then went totally dark, signaling that the cellular feed was active and successfully recording. I snapped the plastic grill back into place, wiping away a single smudge my thumb had left on the shiny exterior surface. I stood up quickly, my heart hammering wildly against my ribs. I grabbed a dusty cardboard box of old high school yearbooks from the bottom shelf of the storage closet and hurried back out into the hallway just as I heard the sharp click of my mother's heels approaching from the kitchen. I plastered the miserable, defeated expression right back onto my face, holding the heavy cardboard box against my chest like a protective shield. Sandra appeared in the doorway holding her steaming coffee mug. She looked at the dusty box and let out a soft, condescending chuckle. She told me I should really focus on finding a lucrative second job instead of crying over old high school memories. I simply nodded, biting the inside of my cheek so hard I actually tasted blood. I thanked her profusely for her boundless generosity, apologized one last time, and walked out the front door. I climbed into my car, setting the box on the passenger seat. I drove 3 blocks away before I finally pulled over and let out a massive, trembling exhale. The humiliating act was officially over. The predator was completely blind and the trap was perfectly set. For 72 hours, my entire existence was reduced to a glowing rectangular window on my laptop screen. I barely slept. I forced myself to eat bland toast and drink black coffee, while obsessively monitoring the encrypted feed from the microcamera I had hidden inside my father's air purifier. The first 2 days offered nothing but mundane domestic routines. I watched my father pace the room while talking to his bankruptcy lawyers on the phone, practicing his desperate ruined man routine with sickening perfection. I watched my mother neatly arrange her paperwork, looking entirely unbothered by the fact that her eldest daughter was about to lose her home. But I knew I just had to be patient. Criminals always celebrate when they think they have won. The motion detection alert finally chimed on my computer late Friday evening. The sky outside my window was completely dark, but the feed from the private study suddenly blazed to life. I leaned in close to the monitor, my heart instantly pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The heavy mahogany door swung open. My father walked in first, followed immediately by my mother, Claire, and Brad. There was no trace of the traumatized family the police had interviewed. There were no tears and no trembling shoulders. My father was carrying a chilled bottle of incredibly expensive champagne and 4 crystal flutes. Brad was actually laughing, his arm wrapped casually around my sister's waist. Claire looked absolutely radiant, wearing a designer silk blouse that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. They settled into the plush leather chairs looking like they had just won the lottery. In reality, they had just stolen it. I turned the volume up on my headphones so high the sound crackled. The microphone I had purchased was exceptional, picking up every single word with terrifying clarity. My father popped the champagne cork and the sound echoed like a gunshot through my silent living room. He poured the drinks with a steady hand, handing them out to his eager audience. He raised his glass high and proposed a toast to a flawless execution and to the brand new chapter waiting for them. The crystal glasses clinked together in a cheerful, sharp sound that made my stomach violently churn. I sat completely paralyzed as they began to dissect their own crime with absolute arrogant pride. Brad leaned back on the leather sofa and complimented my father on his brilliant acting during the staged home invasion. He laughed as he described how easy it was to kick in the back door and how perfectly Claire had played the role of the terrified victim handing over the bearer bonds. Claire giggled, taking a sip of her champagne, and boasted about how she had practiced her hysterical sobbing in the mirror for 3 straight weeks to make sure the detectives would buy every single tear. They had plotted the entire thing together. The robbery was a perfectly choreographed theatrical production designed to completely mask the disappearance of $5 million from the federal government and the aggressive creditors. My father bragged about how the bankruptcy judge had swallowed their story whole. He explained with deep satisfaction how the untraceable bonds were already secured in a private vault, waiting to be washed and transferred out of the country. They were celebrating the fact that they had successfully outsmarted the IRS, the local police, and the bank. But the most agonizing part of the recording was still coming. The conversation naturally shifted to the $2 million corporate debt they had deliberately left behind. Brad chuckled, taking a long sip of his drink, and brought up his late-night visit to my house. He told my parents how he had backed me into a corner and threatened to frame me as the inside informant. He proudly declared that I was completely terrified and that I would inevitably fold under the pressure of the bank foreclosure. He assured them I was too weak and too conditioned to ever fight back against the family. I watched my father's face on the screen. The man who had raised me, the man I had sacrificed my retirement and my credit score to save, simply nodded in agreement. He said it was a necessary casualty of doing business. He showed absolutely zero remorse for the fact that his eldest child was currently facing total financial destruction. Then my mother spoke. Sandra set her crystal flute on the wooden desk and smoothed her skirt with that familiar cold precision. I held my breath, waiting for at least a fraction of maternal guilt to cross her face. There was none. She looked at the others with a deeply pragmatic expression. She said Sarah has always been independent. She can go rent an apartment. We have to secure Claire's future in Belize. The words echoed through my headphones, slicing through the last remaining threads of my broken heart. She delivered that sentence so casually, so ruthlessly, as if my entire life was nothing more than a minor logistical inconvenience they had successfully managed. My mother was completely fine with throwing me onto the streets just so her golden child could live a life of absolute luxury in a tropical paradise. Belize was the ultimate destination, a country known for its complex extradition laws and favorable offshore banking environments. They were planning to take the $5 million and vanish, leaving me to drown in their $2 million nightmare. I watched the video feed for another 20 minutes, listening to them finalize the details of their upcoming escape flight. Every single second of their triumphant conversation was automatically recording directly to my encrypted hard drive. The evidence was absolutely flawless. It was a complete, unfiltered confession to federal tax evasion, bankruptcy fraud, and grand larceny captured in high-definition video and crystal-clear audio. I reached out and gently closed my laptop. The blue light faded, leaving me sitting in the dark shadows of my home office. The intense, suffocating grief that had been crushing my chest for the past week completely burned away in that exact moment. It was replaced by a pure, absolute focus. The devoted daughter who had desperately tried to save her parents was officially dead. She had died the second Sandra uttered those words about securing Claire's future. In her place was a deeply furious forensic accountant holding the digital matches to burn their entire lives to the ground. The truth was finally in my hands, and I knew exactly how I was going to use it. The local police precinct was an absolute dead end. I had learned that bitter lesson on the very night my family staged their brilliant armed robbery. If I marched into a municipal station right now with a plastic flash drive and a wild story about my parents faking a $5 million heist to dodge a massive bankruptcy, the desk sergeant would politely nod and escort me right back out to the street. Local detectives are trained to handle broken windows, domestic disputes, and stolen televisions. They simply do not have the sophisticated resources, the federal jurisdiction, or the financial literacy to unravel a highly complex offshore money laundering conspiracy masquerading as a routine. Chapter 7, Bankruptcy. I knew with absolute certainty that I needed someone who fluently spoke the complex language of federal financial crimes. I needed a predator. I spent my entire weekend locked in my home office, aggressively scouring legal databases and corporate registries. I completely bypassed the friendly family law practitioners and the local criminal defense attorneys who promised sympathetic representation. I was hunting for a very specific breed of legal muscle. That is exactly how I discovered Arthur Davis. Davis was not the kind of lawyer who advertised his services on colorful highway billboards or late-night television commercials. He was a notoriously ruthless former criminal investigator for the Internal Revenue Service. He had spent 2 solid decades hunting down tax-evading billionaires, shell company architects, and corporate embezzlers before retiring to open his own private boutique law firm. His reputation in the downtown financial sector was absolutely terrifying. He was widely known for being vicious, incredibly expensive, and utterly devoid of human sympathy. He was precisely the man I needed to tear my family apart. On Monday morning, I walked into his high-rise downtown office. The sprawling space was completely intimidating and entirely stripped of any warm, inviting decor. There were no smiling family photos on the desk, and no leafy potted plants in the corners. There was just cold polished glass, dark mahogany wood, and massive floor-to-ceiling windows offering a sweeping panoramic view of the gray city skyline. Davis sat behind his massive desk, radiating a quiet, dangerous energy. He was a sharp-featured man in his late 50s with cold, calculating eyes that looked like they could instantly determine the exact numerical value of your entire life. I sat down in the stiff leather chair directly across from him and slid my encrypted flash drive across the polished wooden surface. I did not waste a single second of his time with dramatic tears or emotional pleas about my broken childhood. I stripped all the personal grief from my voice and gave him the raw, clinical facts. I outlined the massive $2 million corporate debt my parents had deliberately dumped onto my shoulders. I detailed the perfectly timed $5 million estate robbery, and I explained the miraculous emergency bankruptcy filing that immediately followed. Davis listened in absolute silence with a blank, unreadable expression. He did not interrupt me once. When I finished speaking, he picked up the small flash drive, plugged it directly into his secure desktop terminal, and opened the hidden video file. For the next 20 minutes, the only sound in that massive, quiet office was the recorded audio of my parents and my sister celebrating their brilliant crime. I sat perfectly still watching Davis as he watched my family. I waited for him to express professional shock or maybe offer a small token word of comfort for the horrific betrayal playing out on his screen. Instead, as my mother proudly boasted about securing Claire's luxurious future in Belize, while casually throwing me to the financial wolves, the corners of his mouth began to twitch. Slowly, a dark, chilling, predatory smile spread across his face. It was the exact smile of a seasoned hunter who had just spotted a massive bleeding target thrashing in the water. He paused the video right on a frozen frame of my father's laughing face. He leaned back in his heavy leather chair, steepling his fingers together, and looked at me with a newfound burning intensity. He told me that what I had captured on that tiny hidden camera was not just a simple case of domestic fraud or a minor family dispute over money. It was a textbook violation of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, perfectly combined with massive federal tax evasion and felony bankruptcy fraud. He explained with absolute delight that my parents had essentially orchestrated a highly illegal criminal enterprise. But then he leaned forward, resting his arms on the desk, and his voice dropped into a low, thrilling register. He asked me if I was intimately familiar with the IRS whistleblower program. As a forensic accountant, I certainly knew the basic parameters of the program, but hearing it actively applied to my own flesh and blood sent a wild rush of pure electricity straight through my veins. Davis broke the strategy down with cold, calculating precision. He explained that if we could successfully track the stolen $5 million to its final offshore destination and hand the complete, beautifully packaged case over to the federal government, the IRS would aggressively move to seize the hidden assets. He smiled again, showing his teeth. He told me that because I was the one providing the definitive inside evidence, the federal law legally entitled me to claim a massive mandatory percentage of the recovered funds. I was not just going to clear the suffocating $2 million debt they had tried to destroy me with. The game had just dramatically shifted in my favor. If we played this exactly right, the federal government would literally pay me a massive fortune to put my own parents in federal prison. I walked into his office, hoping to save my modest house, but I was going to walk out with the power to take absolutely everything they had ever owned. The sharp, heavy knock on my front door came just before 9 a.m, breaking the total silence of my living room. I was sitting at my kitchen island, surrounded by thick stacks of printed tax documents and highlighted corporate ledgers. When I opened the door, a tired-looking man in a faded windbreaker handed me a thick manila envelope and walked away without saying a single word. I tore open the heavy paper flap and pulled out the crisp, white documents hidden inside. The bold black letters printed across the very top of the first page made my stomach violently drop. It was a formal notice of default and an emergency order of foreclosure. The massive commercial bank was officially moving to seize my property to cover the staggering $2 million business loan my parents had deliberately defaulted on. I scanned the dense legal paragraphs until my eyes locked onto the timeline. I had exactly 14 days to completely vacate the premises. 14 days before local county sheriffs would arrive to forcibly remove my belongings and change the locks on the only safe haven I had ever truly known. I looked around at the beautiful hardwood floors I had painstakingly restored and the quiet, comfortable life I had built entirely on my own. A crushing, suffocating wave of pure panic threatened to pull me completely under. My own parents were sitting comfortably in their massive suburban estate, toasting their newfound stolen wealth while casually counting down the days until their eldest daughter was permanently thrown out onto the cold street. I grabbed my car keys and the terrible foreclosure notice, driving straight to the downtown high-rise office of Arthur Davis. I practically ran past his startled receptionist, gripping the legal documents so tightly my knuckles were completely white. I slammed the papers down on his polished mahogany desk and told him we were entirely out of time. I explained with a desperate, trembling voice that my house was going to be publicly auctioned off in exactly 2 weeks, and my entire professional life was about to be permanently destroyed by this fraudulent debt. Davis did not blink or offer any useless words of comfort. He simply picked up the eviction notice and scanned it carefully with his cold, calculating eyes. He calmly set the paper down and told me that blind panic was a completely worthless emotion right now. He explained that we could quickly draft a series of emergency injunctions to try and stall the commercial bank, but local civil judges rarely intervened in straightforward corporate defaults without incredibly compelling federal evidence. The brilliant audio and video recordings I had captured of my family drinking expensive champagne and bragging about their massive fraudulent scheme were incredibly damning, but they were absolutely not enough to trigger an immediate federal intervention. He leaned back in his heavy leather chair, steepling his fingers together, and watched me process the grim reality of our situation. He said the legal system was a slow-moving machine, and the bank holding my fraudulent debt had a terrifying head start. We had to completely disrupt their momentum by escalating this fight to the absolute highest levels of federal law enforcement before the county sheriff physically removed my belongings. Davis leaned forward across the wide desk and outlined the brutal, uncompromising reality of federal financial investigations. He told me that the Criminal Investigation Division of the federal government does not launch massive coordinated raids based solely on domestic surveillance footage of people boasting over drinks. He said clever defense attorneys could easily spin the hidden video as a drunken hypothetical joke or a pathetic family fantasy fueled by financial stress. To force a federal judge to sign an emergency asset freeze and authorize a physical tactical raid on my parents' home, we desperately needed concrete numerical proof. We absolutely needed the specific offshore routing numbers. Davis explained that the $5 million my family stole from the estate did not just magically teleport to a sunny tropical beach in Belize. Moving that kind of massive, untraceable wealth required a highly sophisticated underground network of digital transfers, dummy corporations, and offshore banking channels. We had to hand the federal government the exact coordinates of their hidden financial fortress. If we could provide the specific routing numbers and account details, the federal agents would have the ironclad probable cause required to freeze the stolen assets, halt the bank foreclosure entirely, and obliterate my parents. Carefully constructed illusion once and for all, Davis made it perfectly clear that the burden of proof rested entirely on my shoulders. The government would happily seize the millions and pay me the whistleblower reward, but only if I delivered the entire completed puzzle wrapped in a neat, undeniable package. I had to become the ultimate insider threat to my own blood relatives. I drove back to my house with a terrifying sense of urgency burning through my veins. The ticking clock of the 14-day eviction hung over my head like a sharp, swinging pendulum ready to drop. I locked myself inside my home office and began to aggressively tear through every single piece of digital data I had successfully managed to pull from the public corporate registries. I used every advanced tracing technique I had mastered during my long career as a senior forensic accountant. I hunted relentlessly through Delaware Shell Company registrations, cross-referenced offshore banking trends, and analyzed the exact dates my father had liquidated his heavy construction equipment. I looked for strange anomalies in their previous tax filings, hoping they had made a sloppy mistake while setting up the dummy accounts. But the critical missing pieces were securely locked away behind highly encrypted international firewalls. Finding an offshore account number without direct physical access to my father's private financial terminal was like trying to find a specific grain of sand in a massive, endless desert. The sheer physical exhaustion began to severely blur my vision, but I completely refused to step away from the monitor. I pushed through the agonizing headaches and the crippling fear of losing my home. The pressure in the room felt physically crushing, because every passing hour brought me one step closer to total ruin. My sister Claire and her smug fiancé Brad were probably busy packing their designer luggage for a permanent tropical vacation, completely oblivious to the silent digital war I was waging from my living room. I promised myself right then and there that I would not let them enjoy a single cent of that stolen money. I realized with bone-chilling clarity that I was no longer just fighting to clear a fraudulent debt or save my 3-bedroom house. I was fighting a desperate high-stakes war for my absolute freedom, and I had less than 2 weeks to unearth the brutal truth before my family successfully buried me alive. The invitation arrived printed on heavy cream cardstock, embossed with expensive gold foil. It felt like holding a physical insult in the palm of my hand. Claire and Brad were hosting an extravagantly lavish engagement party at a newly leased waterfront property. I pulled my 10-year-old sedan up the long, winding driveway, wedging it between a pristine row of luxury SUVs and imported sports cars. The sheer audacity of their display was absolutely breathtaking. It had been barely 2 weeks since my parents declared total financial ruin and threw my life onto the sacrificial altar of federal bankruptcy. Yet here they were throwing a catered celebration that easily cost upwards of $50,000. Intricate ice sculptures adorned the manicured lawns. A professional string quartet played softly near a sprawling champagne fountain. Every single detail screamed of sudden, untraceable wealth. The $5 million they had stolen in their meticulously staged robbery was currently funding the most arrogant display of criminal success I had ever witnessed. I sat in my driver's seat for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel until my hands physically ached. I had to completely bury the seasoned forensic accountant and resurrect the broken submissive sister they all believed I was. I smoothed down my plain navy dress, took a deep, steadying breath, and stepped out into the crisp evening air. The moment I crossed the threshold into the grand foyer, I let my shoulders slump forward, perfectly mimicking the posture of a woman utterly crushed by impending foreclosure. My mother was standing near the grand curved staircase, holding court with a group of her wealthy country club friends. She wore a stunning emerald evening gown that draped flawlessly over her frame. When her eyes locked onto mine, the warm, radiant smile she had been giving her guests instantly chilled into absolute ice. She excused herself and marched directly toward me, her heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. Sandra did not offer a warm hug or a maternal greeting. She immediately looked me up and down with an expression of profound clinical disappointment. She told me in a hushed, aggressive whisper that she expected me to behave tonight. She explicitly warned me not to ruin Claire's magical evening with my pathetic financial anxiety or my delusional conspiracy theories about the robbery. I looked down at the floor, forcing my voice to tremble just slightly. I promised her I would stay completely out of the way. I told her I was just deeply grateful to be included after the terrible strain I had put on the family. That was exactly what she wanted to hear. Her posture relaxed, absorbing my absolute submission like a dry sponge. I drifted toward the expansive outdoor patio, where waiters in crisp white shirts were circulating with silver trays of expensive caviar and imported truffles. Claire was holding court near the edge of the infinity pool, looking like a flawless princess in a custom-tailored silk dress. Brad stood right beside her, his arm wrapped tightly around her waist, projecting the ultimate image of a successful, protective future husband. When they spotted me walking toward them, Brad's eyes darkened for a fraction of a second. The The cold, calculating predator I had faced in my dark hallway briefly flashed beneath his charming veneer, but he quickly recovered, flashing a bright television-ready smile. Claire let out a high-pitched, theatrical gasp and pulled me into a brief, rigid hug that felt exactly like embracing a plastic mannequin. She loudly thanked me for coming, claiming it showed immense emotional growth on my part. Brad offered me a glass of champagne with a smug, knowing smirk. He leaned in close, his breath brushing against my ear, and quietly praised me for finally learning my proper place in the family hierarchy. I took the glass with a deliberately shaky hand, murmuring a quiet congratulation. Every fiber of my being screamed to throw the expensive liquor right into his smug face, but I forced myself to swallow the burning bile rising in my throat. I had to let them feel entirely invincible. The rest of the evening was a grueling psychological marathon. Word had clearly spread through the tight-knit circles of our extended family and my mother's prominent church congregation. I was completely and totally alienated. As I stood quietly near the buffet tables, picking at a plate of untouched appetizers, I endured a relentless barrage of passive-aggressive insults. Aunt Linda cornered me near the extravagant dessert station, offering her unsolicited prayers for my deteriorating mental health. She patted my arm condescendingly, telling me that jealousy was a deeply toxic sin and that I should really try to be happy for my sister instead of inventing wild stories to steal her well-deserved spotlight. A senior deacon from my parents' church approached me moments later, shaking his head with profound visible pity. He quietly suggested that the extreme stress of my impending bankruptcy was heavily clouding my moral judgment, advising me to seek immediate spiritual counseling to heal my bitter, isolated heart. They all viewed me as a tragic, unstable failure who had tried to destroy her own family out of pure spite. They openly praised Richard and Sandra for their incredible resilience in the face of a violent, terrifying robbery while treating me like a diseased outcast. I smiled weakly at every single insult that came my way. I nodded submissively at every cruel piece of unwarranted advice. I let them lecture me, pity me, and completely dismiss my entire existence. I bit my tongue so hard, I actually tasted copper in the back of my mouth. They looked at my plain dress and my lowered eyes and thought I was drowning in an ocean of despair. They had absolutely no idea that my silence was not a surrender. My silence was a highly calculated weapon. Every smug laugh, every expensive drop of champagne, every arrogant boast about their bright future was just driving the final nails into their own coffins. I was perfectly content to play the defeated loser tonight because I knew with absolute bone-chilling certainty that the federal trap was already set and the countdown to their total destruction had officially begun. The gentle clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the low hum of pretentious laughter suddenly faded as the hired string quartet packed up their instruments. It was time for the main event. My mother tapped a silver spoon against her glass, commanding the absolute attention of the entire room. A massive projection screen descended slowly over the edge of the infinity pool. It was an obscenely lavish photo montage chronicling Claire and Brad's supposedly perfect romance. The wealthy guests gathered closely around the patio, cooing and fawning as high-definition images of luxury resort vacations and staged candid moments flashed across the canvas. Every single person in that waterfront mansion was completely captivated by the glowing screen and the emotional speeches. It was the absolute perfect diversion. I slipped quietly away from the crowded wooden deck, melting seamlessly into the deep shadows of the main hallway. My heart immediately began to hammer a frantic, erratic rhythm against my ribs. I walked swiftly toward the grand, sweeping staircase, making sure my soft shoes made absolutely no sound against the polished marble floor. I ascended the carpeted steps 2 at a time, practically holding my breath until I reached the dimly lit second-floor corridor. I knew exactly where I needed to go. During one of my previous mandated visits, pretending to be the supportive older sister, I had carefully mapped out the layout of their new sprawling estate. Brad's private home office was situated at the very far end of the hall, behind a set of heavy double oak doors. The brass handle turned with a smooth, silent click. I stepped inside and gently eased the door shut behind me, plunging myself into the quiet darkness of the room. The space smelled strongly of expensive leather and stale whiskey. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight, blocking out the ambient light from the party raging on the patio below. I crossed the thick Persian rug and sat down at his massive glass desk. His sleek silver laptop sat right in the center, completely asleep. My hands were shaking so violently, I had to press my palms flat against the cold desk surface just to steady them. I reached inside the hidden pocket of my dress and pulled out a small black USB drive. Attorney Davis had provided this highly customized piece of hardware specifically engineered to bypass standard encryptions and execute a rapid mass data clone. I took a sharp gulp of air and pushed the metal drive directly into the side port of the machine. The screen instantly flared to life, casting a harsh pale glow across my face. A small black terminal window popped up, bypassing the password prompt entirely, just as Davis had promised. Lines of bright green code began scrolling down the screen at a dizzying speed. A small progress bar appeared right in the center of the display, indicating the percentage of files being mirrored. 10%, 20%. The progress bar crawled forward at an agonizingly sluggish pace. 30%, 40%. Every single second felt like a heavy physical weight pressing down on my chest. I stared at the glowing numbers, desperately urging the malicious software to work faster. Davis had warned me that the extraction could take up to 3 minutes depending on the size of the encrypted offshore ledgers. 3 minutes is an absolute eternity when you are actively infiltrating a hostile mansion. I could hear the faint rhythmic thumping of the bass from the patio speakers outside, blending with the frantic thudding of my own pulse. I wiped a bead of cold sweat from my forehead, keeping one hand hovering right over the drive, ready to pull it out at the slightest noise. 55%, 65%. The malware was successfully tearing through the complex digital vaults Brad had built to conceal the stolen family fortune. Then my blood turned to absolute ice. I heard the distinct, heavy thud of footsteps echoing on the hardwood stairs. Someone was coming up to the second floor. The laughter from the party downstairs grew suddenly louder as the hallway door opened and closed. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, and moving straight down the corridor toward the office. I recognized that arrogant, unhurried stride immediately. It was Brad. 80%. 90%. The brass handle of the office door actually began to slowly turn. I was completely trapped. My mind raced through 1,000 terrifying scenarios of what he would do to me if he found me sitting at his desk stealing his financial secrets. The progress bar finally hit 100%, with a tiny faint visual flash. I violently yanked the USB drive from the port, shoving it deep into my pocket, and slammed the laptop lid down just as the heavy oak door began to swing wide open. There was only one possible escape route. I threw myself silently toward the thick velvet curtains covering the French doors that led out to the private second-story balcony. I slipped behind the heavy fabric, slid the glass door open a mere fraction of an inch, and squeezed my body out into the freezing night air, pulling the door completely shut right as the office lights clicked on. The winter air was completely brutal. It felt like walking directly into a solid wall of freezing ice. The bitter wind whipped fiercely around the side of the waterfront property, slicing right through the thin, elegant fabric of my dress and chilling my bare skin down to the bone. I pressed my spine perfectly flat against the rough, textured exterior brickwork, sliding my freezing body as far away from the glass pane as physically possible. I clamped both of my trembling hands securely over my mouth, shutting my eyes tight to completely stifle the chaotic, gasping breaths tearing through my throat. My teeth began to chatter uncontrollably, so I bit down hard on my own lower lip until the sharp metallic taste of blood flooded my tongue. I cracked my eyelids just a fraction of an inch, peering through the small sliver of exposed glass between the velvet curtains. Brad was moving casually around the brightly lit room. He walked straight over to a polished wooden humidor sitting atop a mahogany bookshelf. He was completely relaxed, humming a soft, cheerful tune under his breath as he carefully selected a thick premium cigar. He stood there for what felt like hours, casually clipping the end of the expensive cigar, while I literally froze to death on the other side of the thin glass pane. Every single muscle in my body seized with a cramping, agonizing tension. If he decided to step out onto the balcony to smoke, I was completely finished. My entire federal case, my absolute freedom, and my chance at justice would instantly vanish into thin air. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying to whatever forces were listening that he would just turn around and walk away. He struck a match, lighting the cigar with a long, slow drag. He glanced casually toward the closed laptop on his desk. My heart practically stopped beating. Then he simply turned on his heel, switched off the overhead lights, and walked out of the room, closing the door securely behind him. The heavy silence rushed back into the dark office. I stayed frozen against the freezing brick wall for another 2 full minutes, making absolutely certain he was gone. My body was violently shivering and my fingers were completely numb, but a massive wave of pure adrenaline carried me forward. I slipped back inside the dark room, scurried across the soft carpet, and eased the hallway door open. The second floor was completely deserted. I ghosted down the back servant staircase, slipping out the side door and into the deep shadows of the massive driveway. I practically sprinted to my 10-year-old sedan, tearing the car door open and locking myself inside. I collapsed against the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel, as violent shivers racked my entire frame. I pulled the tiny black USB drive from my pocket. It felt heavier than a solid block of gold. I plugged it directly into my own encrypted tablet, balancing the device on my trembling knees. I quickly opened the downloaded directory, bypassing the cloned security folders. My eyes scanned the vast ocean of digital files until they locked onto a specific hidden spreadsheet. There they were. The exact offshore routing numbers, multiple dummy corporations registered in the Cayman Islands, and the precise transaction logs matching the $5 million stolen from my parents' estate. They had hidden their stolen fortune exactly where Arthur Davis predicted. I looked at the little black drive in my hands, and a slow, cold smile spread across my face. I had the undisputed, ironclad proof right in my possession, and my family had absolutely no idea. The federal storm was about to tear their perfect lives to pieces. The morning air in downtown Seattle tasted like damp concrete and exhaust, but to me it tasted like pure, unadulterated victory. I marched into Arthur Davis' high-rise office building before the sun had even fully breached the horizon. The receptionist was not even at her desk yet. I bypassed the waiting area entirely and pushed open the heavy glass door to his private suite. Davis was already there. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window holding a steaming ceramic mug of black coffee, looking out at the gray waking city. He did not look surprised to see me barging in at the crack of dawn. He took one look at the dark circles under my eyes and the tiny black plastic drive tightly clenched in my right hand. He simply set his mug down, walked over to his massive mahogany desk, and booted up his secure terminal. I dropped the cloned USB drive onto the polished wood. It landed with a tiny clatter that sounded deafening in the quiet room. I told him I had exactly what we needed. I told him I had stood in the freezing cold on a second-story balcony, hiding like a criminal in my own sister's home, and stolen the digital soul of my parents' entire operation. Davis did not waste time with congratulations. He plugged the drive into a specialized isolated port designed to prevent any self-destruct malware from wiping the files. For a forensic accountant like me, this was the moment of absolute truth. We were about to look directly into the beating heart of their betrayal. The screen flickered to life, displaying a complex wall of encrypted folders. Brad thought he was clever. He had used a military-grade encryption protocol to lock down the financial directories. But Brad was a cocky real estate developer, not a cybersecurity expert. He had left the automated backup logs completely unprotected. Davis initiated a decryption sequence using a proprietary software his firm retained for high-level corporate espionage cases. We sat side by side in the dim office, bathed in the harsh white glow of the computer monitor, listening to the quiet hum of the processor. My stomach twisted into tight, agonizing knots. I was terrified the file might be corrupted. I was terrified I had risked my life and my freedom for an empty folder. Then, with a soft digital chime, the firewall collapsed. The folders unzipped themselves, spilling their hidden contents across the wide monitor. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the dense rows of financial data with the practiced speed of a veteran auditor. Numbers tell a story that people cannot hide. And the story unfolding on the screen was a masterpiece of premeditated greed. I found the master ledger within 3 minutes. It was a beautifully organized spreadsheet detailing the exact flow of the $5 million that had vanished during the staged home invasion. My parents had not just hidden the stolen cash in a mattress. They had meticulously washed it through a dummy corporation. I pointed to a specific string of transactions highlighting a newly registered shell company located in Delaware. It was completely anonymous, shielding the true owners behind layers of registered agents. But the routing numbers did not lie. From Delaware, the money had been systematically fractured into dozens of smaller wire transfers. I tracked every single penny as it bounced through intermediary accounts in Panama and Switzerland, designed specifically to confuse IRS tracking algorithms. But all those tangled digital threads ultimately converged into one massive offshore holding account. It was an irrevocable trust firmly planted in the Cayman Islands, a notorious tax haven completely immune to standard American subpoenas. The primary beneficiaries listed on the trust were Richard, Sandra, Claire, and Brad. My name was noticeably absolutely absent. They had cleanly secured $5 million in untraceable liquid wealth while deliberately setting me up to be crushed by their discarded $2 million debt. The sheer clinical perfection of their scheme was breathtaking. Davis let out a low, impressed whistle, muttering that my father was a much better criminal than he ever was a legitimate businessman. We had the smoking gun. We had the exact offshore account numbers, the routing trails, and the undeniable proof of federal tax evasion and bankruptcy fraud. It was everything the IRS whistleblower program required to launch a devastating tactical raid. But as I scrolled down to the very bottom of the master directory, a separate folder caught my eye. It was simply labeled Logistics. I clicked it open, expecting to find property deeds or offshore bank contacts. Instead, an electronic receipt from a major international airline filled the monitor. My blood instantly turned to freezing ice. It was a flight itinerary. 4 one-way first-class tickets departing from Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The destination was Philip S.W. Goldson International Airport in Belize. I quickly scanned the passenger names: Richard Myers, Sandra Myers, Claire Myers, Bradley Harrison. The departure date hit me like a physical punch to the throat. They were not leaving next month. They were not leaving next week. The flight was booked for this coming Sunday at 6 a.m. I stared at the digital calendar in the corner of the screen. Today was Thursday. They were fleeing the country in less than 72 hours. The sheer panic I had felt when I received my home foreclosure notice was nothing compared to the absolute terror that gripped me now. Once they stepped onto that plane and crossed into international airspace, the game was completely over. Belize did not have a friendly extradition treaty for white-collar financial crimes. Once they landed, they would disappear into a tropical paradise fueled by millions of stolen dollars, leaving me completely trapped in America to face the angry banks, the aggressive debt collectors, and the total destruction of my professional life. They were tying up their loose ends and making a run for it. Davis sat up straight, the casual amusement entirely vanishing from his face. The window for a slow, methodical legal strategy had just violently slammed shut. We could no longer wait for the standard bureaucratic wheels of the federal government to turn. If we filed the paperwork through normal channels, my family would be sipping cocktails on a private beach long before a single federal agent even opened the file. I looked at the seasoned attorney sitting next to me, feeling a cold, hardened resolve settle deep into my bones. I told him we had exactly 3 days to corner 4 fleeing criminals. I told him we needed to bypass the red tape and detonate this bomb immediately. Davis grabbed his desk phone, his eyes burning with a dangerous predatory light. He told me to brace myself because we were about to wake up the deadliest federal agents in the city. The heavy scent of roasted prime rib and expensive floral arrangements hit me the moment I stepped into the grand ballroom of the Oakwood Country Club. It was Saturday evening and the massive grandfather clock in the lobby read exactly 7 o'clock. In a mere 11 hours, my parents and my sister would be boarding a first-class flight to Belize, forever vanishing with $5 million of stolen money. Yet instead of quietly packing their designer suitcases and slipping away into the night, they had decided to squeeze one final drop of blood from their social circle. They were hosting a farewell and rebuilding gala. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the event made a thick, heavy knot of nausea twist deep in my gut. This was not a humble gathering of close friends saying goodbye. It was a highly orchestrated theatrical production designed to completely milk the sympathies and the wallets of their wealthy church congregation and former business associates. They had sent out urgent, elegant invitations claiming that the devastating home invasion and subsequent bankruptcy had left them entirely destitute. They framed this lavish party as a desperate plea for community support to help them start over from scratch in a smaller, cheaper state. I stood near the back of the room, hiding in the shadows of a towering swan ice sculpture holding a glass of sparkling water I could not stomach. The room was packed with the local elite. Bankers, local politicians, and senior deacons from the church were all dressed in their finest evening wear, actively writing massive checks to support the tragically ruined Myers family. A large crystal bowl sat on the main welcome table, rapidly filling with thick white envelopes and stacks of cash. My father stood at the center of a large group, wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit that completely belied his supposed poverty. I watched him accept a thick envelope from a retired surgeon, grasping the older man's hand with both of his own. He lowered his head, projecting the exact image of a humbled, broken man, relying on the pure kindness of old friends. He muttered quiet words of immense gratitude, wiping a completely fake tear from the corner of his eye. My mother, Sandra, was an absolute vision of manufactured sorrow. She glided from table to table, dabbing her dry eyes with a monogrammed lace handkerchief. She recounted the terrifying fictional tale of the armed robbery to anyone who would listen, painting herself as a traumatized survivor, just trying to hold her family together in the face of total disaster. The wealthy wives of local executives practically fell over themselves to press donation checks into her eager, waiting hands. They offered soft prayers and gentle hugs, completely blind to the fact that they were hugging a millionaire criminal who was laughing at them behind her tear-soaked handkerchief. Claire and Brad played their supporting roles flawlessly. They stood by the main entrance, greeting the arriving donors with brave, tight smiles. Brad had actually styled his hair to look slightly disheveled, conveying the image of a stressed, protective future husband. Claire wore a simple, understated gray dress that was light years away from the expensive, shimmering silk she had worn just a few nights prior at her private engagement celebration. She leaned heavily against Brad, looking fragile and scared, perfectly selling the illusion of a young woman whose future had been violently stolen. The hypocrisy was so thick and suffocating it made the air in the ballroom physically hard to breathe. Every time my mother sighed tragically or my father offered a bravely stoic nod, a fresh wave of intense revulsion washed over me. These people were actively stealing from their own trusted friends. They had $5 million of untraceable federal money safely parked in a Cayman Islands trust. They had non-extraditable plane tickets waiting for them at the airport, and yet they were spending their final hours in America scamming their most loyal supporters out of thousands of dollars in fake charity. The sheer greed was a bottomless black pit. Aunt Linda marched right up to me near the silent auction tables, clutching a bidding paddle and her leather checkbook. She looked at me with deep, searing disapproval. She told me she hoped I was finally seeing what true family support looked like tonight. She proudly declared that she had just donated her entire summer vacation fund to help my parents recover from the horrific trauma they had endured. She told me it was a supreme tragedy that strangers and extended family had to step up because their eldest daughter was too selfish to contribute. I looked at her completely brainwashed face and felt a terrifying mix of profound pity and simmering fury. I bit the inside of my cheek, tasting a faint metallic tang of blood, and simply nodded my head in submissive agreement. I could not break my cover. Not tonight. Not when Arthur Davis and the federal agents were meticulously positioning their final pieces on the board. At exactly 8:30, my father walked up to the small wooden podium at the front of the ballroom. He tapped the microphone, creating a sharp feedback whine that brought the loud room to a dead halt. He gripped the edges of the podium, looking out over the sea of generous, wealthy faces. He spoke about resilience. He spoke about the devastating pain of losing everything you have worked your entire life to build. His voice trembled beautifully as he described the terrifying night the imaginary robbers kicked in their back door and took their financial security. He thanked the community for their beautiful, overwhelming financial support, claiming their generous donations would be the only foundation of the family survival. The entire ballroom erupted into a massive standing ovation. People were actually weeping openly, wiping their eyes with expensive linen dinner napkins. I stood in the shadows, completely paralyzed by the monstrous scale of their deception. I watched the golden children and the resilient parents soak up the roaring applause of the people they were actively robbing blind. My stomach violently churned, forcing me to press my hand hard against my abdomen to keep from throwing up. The pure evil required to look your closest friends in the eyes and rob them while begging for their prayers was beyond human comprehension. I kept my eyes locked on my mother's triumphant smiling face, taking silent, fierce comfort in the devastating secret burning a hole in my mind. They thought they had successfully played the ultimate winning hand and were walking away rich. They had absolutely no idea the game was already over. The air inside Arthur Davis' private office felt remarkably different on that pivotal Tuesday morning. It was heavily charged with a sharp metallic anticipation, the exact kind of electric tension that precedes a massive violent thunderstorm. We had spent the last 48 hours completely refining the stolen digital evidence, transforming a chaotic mountain of offshore routing numbers and cloned directories into an absolutely lethal legal weapon. I was 31 years old, a seasoned forensic accountant who had spent my entire adult life desperately trying to save my family from impending financial ruin. I had gladly sacrificed my credit score, my personal savings, and my own sanity just to keep my parents comfortably afloat. But as I sat staring at the thick, perfectly bound dossier resting on the polished mahogany desk, I fully realized that the devoted, subservient daughter was permanently dead. In her place sat a focused, dangerous woman entirely ready to dismantle the very people who had tried to bury her alive. Davis did not bother sending our explosive files through standard digital reporting channels. He made a single secure phone call directly to a regional director he had known for decades. Within 20 short minutes, two incredibly stern-looking men in dark gray suits walked into the private suite. They were senior special agents from the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division, accompanied closely by a veteran liaison from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They did not smile or offer polite morning greetings. They sat directly across from us, opened the heavy dossier, and began to read. I sat perfectly still, watching their eyes track across the printed pages, observing the exact moment their professional bureaucratic skepticism violently shifted into cold-focused predatory interest. The evidence we provided was utterly pristine. It was a comprehensive masterpiece of undeniable proof. The federal agents silently reviewed the detailed transaction logs, showing exactly how the stolen $5 million had been efficiently washed through the anonymous Delaware shell company. They meticulously examined the subsequent digital wire transfers, bouncing through highly complex international banking corridors, before finally settling into the irrevocable trust safely hidden down in the Cayman Islands. But the true fatal blow, the specific piece of undeniable evidence that made the senior FBI agent immediately reach for his encrypted cellular phone, was the confirmed flight itinerary. 4 one-way first-class tickets to Belize securely booked for this coming Sunday morning. The suspects were no longer just white-collar fraudsters. They were an active, immediate flight risk. The usual frustrating window for bureaucratic government delays slammed completely shut right then and there. I sat completely silent, listening as the heavy, massive machinery of federal justice roared to life all around me. Davis spoke their language flawlessly, barking out specific legal statutes and demanding immediate aggressive preventative measures. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, an emergency judicial hearing was rapidly convened behind heavily closed doors with a federal magistrate judge. The sheer undeniable volume and absolute structural clarity of our cloned data left zero room for any judicial hesitation. Before the sun even began to dip below the hazy Seattle skyline, the federal judge signed a massive stack of emergency warrants. Simultaneously sweeping global asset freezing orders were instantly transmitted directly to the highest international banking authorities. The $5 million sitting comfortably in the Caribbean was aggressively locked down in a matter of seconds. My parents and my sister could not touch a single stolen penny of their hidden fortune. Their massive financial safety net had been completely vaporized without a single warning shot, and they were entirely oblivious to the incoming destruction. With the inescapable legal snare perfectly set and waiting to violently snap shut, I left the downtown high-rise office and drove straight back to my quiet neighborhood. The brutal 14-day eviction notice was still sitting exactly where I had left it on my kitchen counter, but it no longer held any terrifying power over me. The crushing, suffocating fear that had paralyzed my chest for weeks had evaporated completely, replaced by a fierce, burning internal clarity. The Grand Farewell Charity Gala was scheduled for tomorrow night at the local country club. It would be their final, arrogant public performance before their planned tropical escape, and I desperately needed to prepare for the ultimate confrontation. I walked slowly upstairs to my silent bedroom and stood directly in front of my narrow closet. For the past bitter decade, I had faithfully dressed myself in cheap, faded thrift store cardigans and deeply discounted, shapeless slacks. I had intentionally made myself look incredibly small, plain, and utterly forgettable, because that was exactly what my demanding mother and my golden sister always required of me. I was the drab, pathetic background character designed solely to make Claire shine much brighter. I reached out and started violently pulling those sad, worn garments off their cheap plastic hangers. I threw the depressing gray sweaters, the ill-fitting beige blouses, and the scuffed flat shoes directly into a large black trash bag. I physically stripped away every single woven reminder of the weak, submissive woman they had so easily manipulated and carelessly discarded. Deep in the very back of my dark closet, hidden securely beneath a protective, opaque plastic cover, hung a garment I had proudly purchased 3 years ago to celebrate passing my rigorous forensic accounting board exams. It was a fiercely tailored, expensive designer power suit in a dark, commanding charcoal gray. I had never actually worn it in public. My mother had taken one single look at the sharp, structured shoulders and the elegant, modern cut and told me it was far too aggressive for a simple, quiet numbers girl. She had effectively shamed me into hiding my own success away in the dark. I reached in, unzipped the thick plastic cover, and pulled the beautiful suit out into the bright room. I slowly dressed myself in the crisp white silk blouse, buttoning it with steady, highly deliberate fingers. I pulled on the perfectly tailored trousers and slipped my arms into the sharp, structured jacket. When I finally stepped in front of the tall, full-length mirror, the reflection staring back at me was an absolute revelation. The exhausted, terrified victim who had begged for her parents' mercy was completely gone. The woman looking back at me radiated absolute lethal confidence. The dark suit fit like a flawless layer of modern corporate armor, completely transforming my entire physical posture. I stood much taller, squaring my shoulders and lifting my chin with a newfound undeniable pride. I paired the striking outfit with a pair of sleek black heels that gave me a sharp, dangerous edge of authority. I was no longer the pathetic, sacrificial lamb waiting quietly for the family slaughter. I was the invisible architect of their impending absolute ruin. They honestly thought I would simply cower in the dark shadows while they shamelessly robbed their closest church friends and fled the country, leaving me to drown alone in their massive fraudulent debt. They had severely and fatally underestimated the quiet older daughter. Tomorrow night, I was going to walk directly into their lavish country club gala with my head held high and watch the unforgiving federal government tear their entire criminal empire down to the very studs. I adjusted the sharp lapel of my charcoal jacket, feeling a cold, beautiful smile spread slowly across my face. The absolute trap was set. The federal warrants were officially signed, and I was finally ready to deliver the ultimate, undeniable truth. The heavy oak doors of the Oakwood Country Club stood before me, like the tall, formidable gates of a beautifully decorated fortress. It was exactly 8 o'clock on Saturday evening. The crisp autumn air bit sharply at my cheeks, but beneath my tailored charcoal power suit, my blood was running incredibly hot with pure electric adrenaline. I stood in the quiet carpeted foyer for a long moment, listening to the muffled sounds of string music and polite applause drifting out from the main ballroom. For my entire life, I had walked into these grand social spaces with my shoulders hunched forward, desperately trying to blend into the wallpaper so my mother and sister could easily command the spotlight. Not tonight. I adjusted the sharp lapels of my jacket, lifted my chin, and prepared to step directly into the absolute epicenter of their massive, fraudulent delusion. I pushed firmly against the brass handles, and the heavy wooden doors swung open silently. The grand ballroom was an absolute masterpiece of manufactured tragedy. Over 100 high society guests were gathered under the glittering crystal chandeliers. These were the wealthiest members of my parents' church congregation, the most prominent local business owners, and the elite country club regulars who had known our family for decades. The massive room was dripping with the exact kind of understated old money wealth that my father had always desperately coveted and ultimately decided to steal. Extravagant white floral arrangements adorned every single dining table, and waiters in crisp uniforms circulated silently with silver trays of expensive champagne. It looked exactly like a high-end charity auction, but the only charity being funded tonight was my parents' immediate escape to a tropical tax haven. I stayed near the back of the room, melting easily into the dark shadows cast by a towering decorative pillar. The atmosphere in the room was incredibly thick and physically suffocating. It smelled of expensive floral perfume, roasted tenderloin, and absolute unadulterated lies. Right at the front of the massive room, elevated on a small wooden stage, stood my parents. They had positioned themselves perfectly in the center of the bright spotlight. My father was wearing a dark, somber suit, holding a wireless microphone with both hands. His posture was meticulously crafted to project the moving image of a proud man who had been violently brought to his knees by cruel circumstances. He was currently speaking to the captivated audience, his voice trembling with a sickeningly perfect pitch of vulnerability. He spoke passionately about the terrifying night the imaginary armed robbers had invaded their sanctuary and stolen their entire life savings. He described the crushing weight of their sudden bankruptcy, deliberately leaving out the minor detail that he had intentionally dumped $2 million of that toxic debt entirely onto my shoulders. He looked out into the crowd of his loyal friends and colleagues and thanked them for their overwhelming financial support, claiming their generous donations were the only thing keeping his family from total destitution. My mother stood right beside him, playing her role with genuine Oscar-winning dedication. Sandra wore a simple, tasteful black dress that made her look incredibly fragile and diminished. She had one hand resting gently on my father's shoulder, while the other clutched a delicate lace handkerchief. As my father spun his elaborate web of deceit, Sandra subtly dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes, nodding bravely at the sympathetic faces weeping in the front row. It was a flawless, mesmerizing performance. At the edge of the wooden stage, a large glass donation box was already overflowing with thick white envelopes and personal checks. These wealthy guests had openly opened their hearts and their bank accounts, believing they were helping a beloved local family rebuild their shattered lives. They had absolutely no idea they were actively funding the luxury tropical retirement of 4 federal fugitives. I watched a prominent local judge step forward to hand my mother a sealed envelope. Sandra took it with both hands, bowing her head and whispering a tearful thank you. The sheer hypocrisy of the intimate moment was so incredibly vile, it made the back of my neck burn with rage. They had $5 million of stolen federal money sitting in a completely untraceable offshore account in the Cayman Islands. They had non-refundable first-class tickets to Belize scheduled to depart in less than 10 hours. And here they were, shamelessly squeezing the very last drops of sympathy and cash from the people who trusted them the most. Claire and Brad were seated at the front table, acting like the traumatized younger generation. Claire was resting her head on Brad's shoulder, looking suitably somber, while Brad patted her hand with fake protective affection. They were completely ready to run. Their bags were undoubtedly already packed and waiting in the trunks of their vehicles. They thought they had executed the absolute perfect crime. They believed they had outsmarted the commercial banks, the local police, the Internal Revenue Service, and the naive older sister they had left behind to drown alone in their massive debt. I felt a cold, brilliant calmness wash over my entire physical body. The fear, the panic, the years of desperate, agonizing need for their approval simply vanished into thin air. I stepped out from behind the dark shadow of the decorative pillar and began to walk straight down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. My dark charcoal suit cut a sharp, distinct contrast against the sea of sparkling evening gowns and soft pastel dresses. My black heels clicked with a steady, rhythmic cadence against the polished hardwood floor. I did not rush, and I did not hesitate. I walked with the deliberate, undeniable authority of a woman who held the absolute truth in the palm of her hand. As I moved deeper into the crowded room, the guests seated at the back tables began to notice me. The low, polite conversations quietly faded into confused murmurs. People turned their heads, their expressions shifting rapidly from polite sympathy to sudden, bewildered curiosity. I was the disgraced, estranged daughter, the one my mother loudly claimed was suffering from a bitter mental breakdown. I was not supposed to be here tonight. I was supposed to be hiding out in my foreclosed home, waiting for the county sheriff to throw me out onto the cold street. The heavy wave of silence rolled steadily forward toward the stage. My father was right in the middle of a dramatic sentence about community and faith when he finally noticed the sudden dramatic shift in the room's energy. He stopped speaking entirely. His eyes scanned the large crowd and locked directly onto me. The healthy color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a pale, terrified ghost. His large hands gripped the edges of the wooden podium so tightly, his knuckles turned completely white under the stage lights. Beside him, my mother slowly lowered her lace handkerchief. Her fake expression of fragile sorrow vanished, completely replaced by a flash of pure, unadulterated panic. She took a tiny, involuntary step backward, her eyes widening in absolute shock as she saw the sharp, confident woman striding down the aisle. Claire and Brad turned around in their chairs and froze, completely paralyzed by the sudden, unexpected disruption of their perfect theatrical performance. I reached the very front of the room, stopping just a few feet away from the elevated stage. The heavy, suffocating silence in the grand ballroom was absolutely deafening. Over 100 wealthy, prominent guests sat perfectly still, holding their collective breath, waiting to see exactly what the disgraced older daughter was about to do. I looked up at my father and my mother standing defensively behind their overflowing box of stolen charity. I did not scream or cry or lose my temper. I just looked at them with a cold, knowing smile, waiting for the spectacular explosion that was only moments away. I did not stop at the edge of the elevated platform. I marched directly up the 3 carpeted steps with a singular, unshakable focus. My dark, tailored power suit acted as my personal armor, deflecting the hundreds of confused stares burning into my back. The wealthy, prominent attendees, the very same people my parents had just mercilessly bled dry with their pathetic crocodile tears, parted like the Red Sea as I made my approach. My mother was still gently dabbing her cheek with that ridiculous lace handkerchief, her other hand resting softly on the polished wooden podium. My father had just finished his grand, agonizing speech about family resilience. I walked straight up to the woman who had brought me into this world. Before she could even register the cold, absolute determination glowing in my eyes, I reached out and ripped the wireless microphone right out of her perfectly manicured hand. The sudden, violent movement caused a harsh electronic feedback shriek to blast through the premium ballroom speakers. It was a piercing mechanical wail that made several prominent local bankers in the front row physically flinch and cover their ears. The collective sharp gasp from over 100 high society guests instantly sucked all the oxygen out of the colossal room. You could hear a pin drop on the hardwood floor. My mother stood entirely paralyzed, her mouth hanging slightly open in a highly unflattering expression of pure unadulterated shock. My father, however, was the first to break the stunned paralysis. The charming, vulnerable victim routine evaporated in a fraction of a second, replaced immediately by the red-faced, raging tyrant I knew entirely too well. He lunged forward, trying to aggressively snatch the microphone back from my grip, but I smoothly pivoted, stepping entirely out of his reach. He immediately turned his attention toward the heavy double doors at the back of the room, raising his arm and shouting frantically for the country club security guards to get up to the stage. He bellowed into the microphone less void that I was having a severe mental breakdown, that I was deeply and dangerously unstable, and that I needed to be forcibly removed immediately for my own safety. Sandra swiftly recovered her theatrical wits, perfectly pivoting to her new narrative. She clutched her chest, performing a magnificent display of agonizing maternal distress. She cried out to the horrified audience, begging them to forgive this terrible public scene, loudly claiming that the profound trauma of the recent robbery had completely shattered my fragile mind. She reached out, trying to grab my arm with a sickening display of fake sympathy, her nails digging painfully into the charcoal fabric of my jacket. I simply looked down at her hand, my expression stripped of all human emotion, until she slowly, nervously pulled her fingers away. I did not yell. I did not engage in a pointless screaming match with them on that elevated platform. I knew that fighting back verbally would only prove their manufactured point and make me look exactly like the hysterical, bitter, estranged daughter they had painted me to be. Instead, I kept my eyes firmly locked on the small audiovisual control cart positioned just a few feet away from the main podium. The hired technician, a young kid wearing a black polo shirt, was staring at our family drama with wide, terrified eyes. I walked briskly over to his station, entirely ignoring my father, who was now desperately ordering 2 older deacons from his church to come up and physically restrain me. The young tech took one single look at my cold, unwavering expression and wisely took a massive step backward, completely abandoning his control board. I pulled my smartphone from my jacket pocket. It was already loaded with the decrypted high-definition video file I had ripped straight from Brad's encrypted laptop. With quick, highly practiced movements, I grabbed the auxiliary display cable resting on the edge of the soundboard and plugged it directly into my mobile device. My father realized exactly what I was doing a fraction of a second too late. He lunged toward the audio cart, his face twisted in pure unmasked terror, screaming at me to stop. But my thumb had already tapped the play button on my glowing screen. The colossal projector that had just been showing softly filtered romantic photos of Claire and Brad's fake perfect life instantly went pitch black. A heartbeat later, the hidden camera footage from my father's private study violently illuminated the massive canvas behind us. The digital image was incredibly sharp, capturing the luxurious mahogany room in crisp, undeniable detail. There, standing 10 feet tall and projected for the entire elite congregation to witness, were my parents, my sister, and her smug fiancé. They were lounging comfortably on plush leather furniture, holding crystal flutes filled with expensive champagne, laughing hysterically. The stark, jarring contrast between the weeping, destitute victims standing on the stage and the arrogant, triumphant criminals glowing on the screen above them was absolutely staggering. A low, confused murmur rippled through the vast sea of wealthy donors. People began to stand up from their decorated tables, their brows furrowed deeply, trying to make sense of the incredible contradiction playing out right in front of their faces. Then the crisp, digitally enhanced audio blasted through the ballroom's surround sound system. The acoustics were remarkably sharp, bouncing off the high ceilings and carrying the undeniable truth to every single corner of the country club. Brad's voice echoed, first laughing cruelly as he explicitly complimented my father on his brilliant acting during the staged home invasion. The crowd below us went completely deathly still. You could physically see the horrible realization dawning on the faces of the bankers and the church elders as they listened to Claire cheerfully boasting about practicing her fake sobbing in the mirror for 3 straight weeks just to fool the local detectives. But the final, most devastating blow came directly from the woman currently standing trembling and defeated beside me. On the massive screen, my mother set her champagne flute down on the desk with cold, calculating precision. Her voice, entirely devoid of the tragic flutter she had been utilizing all evening, boomed through the silent, breathless room with ruthless clarity. "Sarah has always been independent," the projected version of my mother declared casually to her room of gleeful conspirators. "She can fend for herself. Let her take the debt. We have to secure Claire's future in Belize." The deafening silence in the grand ballroom was shattered only by the heavy breathing of the outraged guests. My mother's recorded voice had just bounced off the premium crystal chandeliers and practically slapped every single person in the room directly across the face. Her callous, casual demand to let me take the massive debt while they secured a luxurious future in Belize hung in the humid air like toxic smoke. The elderly retired surgeon who had just handed my father a massive donation check literally dropped his delicate crystal glass. It shattered against the polished hardwood floor, sending sharp, sparkling shards scattering across the room, but nobody even blinked or looked down. Every single eye in the country club was completely glued to the massive projection screen. My father looked exactly like a man who had just stepped directly onto a live landmine. He stood completely frozen behind the ornate wooden podium, his mouth opening and closing in rapid succession like a suffocating fish trying to find oxygen. Sandra had taken 2 large, staggering steps backward, her hands covering her mouth as her flawless theatrical composure was entirely and permanently destroyed. I did not give them a single second to recover their senses or invent another elaborate, impossible lie. I tapped the screen of my smartphone, bringing up the next piece of undeniable forensic evidence. The image on the giant projector shifted seamlessly from the hidden video footage to a highly detailed commercial banking document. I turned my body to face the massive crowd, pitching my voice loud and clear, so it carried all the way to the heavy oak doors at the back of the room. I introduced myself as the deeply unstable, ungrateful daughter they had been eagerly gossiping about all evening. Then I asked them to direct their full attention to the incredibly complex financial spreadsheet currently towering over my parents' heads. I methodically broke down their entire criminal enterprise piece by piece, translating the highly complex offshore banking data into plain, undeniable English. I pointed directly to the glowing red numbers on the screen, explaining exactly how the $5 million from the supposedly tragic home invasion had been carefully and systematically washed. I showed them the digital registration of the dummy corporation located in Delaware, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the anonymous shell company was entirely controlled by Richard and Sandra. I walked the horrified audience through every single digital wire transfer, showing exactly how the stolen estate money had bounced rapidly through anonymous offshore channels before landing safely in an irrevocable trust hidden deep in the Cayman Islands. The wealthy crowd of high society donors, church elders, and local politicians began to openly murmur in pure, unadulterated disgust. A prominent real estate developer sitting near the front row stood up violently from his chair, pointing an angry, trembling finger directly at my father. He demanded to know if the financial ledgers glowing on the screen were actually real. My father desperately shook his head, stammering out pathetic, half-formed sentences about digital manipulation, fake documents, and elaborate, terrible misunderstandings. But numbers simply do not lie, and the pristine corporate documents glowing brightly behind him bore the undeniable official verification seals of multiple international banking institutions. I tapped my glowing screen one more time. The offshore bank statements instantly vanished from the projector, replaced by a crisp digital airline itinerary. I watched the very last remaining drops of blood completely drain from Claire's pale face as her personal travel details were broadcast to the entire country club. I told the silent, horrified audience to look very closely at the scheduled departure date. I explained clearly that those were 4 one-way first-class tickets to Philip S. W. Goldson International Airport in Belize. I made absolutely sure every single person in that crowded room understood that the expensive flight was scheduled to depart at 6 a.m. on Sunday. Tomorrow morning. The heavy wave of absolute revulsion that washed over the ballroom was physically palpable. I looked directly into the stunned faces of the generous, sympathetic friends who had spent the last 2 hours writing massive personal checks and offering deeply emotional prayers for my ruined, tragic family. I calmly explained the ultimate sickening truth of their beautiful farewell gala. I told them that my parents already had $5 million of stolen federal money sitting securely in a tropical tax haven. They had successfully funded their luxurious early retirement entirely by faking a violent armed robbery, hiding their massive liquid assets, and deliberately dumping a massive $2 million corporate debt squarely onto my shoulders to ensure I would be permanently destroyed in their wake. But that terrible crime was simply not enough to satisfy their bottomless, endless greed. I gestured toward the large crystal bowl overflowing with stacked cash and thick white envelopes sitting right on the edge of the stage. I told the angry crowd that my parents had intentionally orchestrated this lavish emotional charity event tonight specifically to scam their most loyal, trusted friends out of a few extra $1,000 before fleeing the country forever. They were literally pickpocketing their own devoted church congregation just hours before running away to a non-extraditable tropical paradise. The public reaction was immediate and absolutely explosive. Aunt Linda, the very same woman who had just lectured me about my toxic jealousy and proudly donated her entire summer vacation fund, let out a sharp, furious cry of betrayal. She marched directly toward the wooden stage, angrily demanding her check back immediately. The retired surgeon followed right behind her, his face flushed red with profound, boiling anger. Within a matter of seconds, the polite, sophisticated country club gathering transformed into an incredibly hostile, screaming mob. Dozens of wealthy, betrayed guests surged aggressively toward the front of the room, shouting furious demands and loud threats at the people they once trusted. My father took several frantic, desperate steps backward, holding both his hands up in a pathetic, useless attempt to calm the very people he had just ruthlessly manipulated. Sandra was actually violently trembling, clutching the wooden podium for physical support as her carefully curated social empire collapsed violently all around her. Claire practically sprinted away from the front display table, hiding completely behind Brad, who looked utterly terrified of the angry approaching donors. They were completely surrounded by their own victims with absolutely nowhere left to run. The wealthy society people they had spent decades manipulating, impressing, and defrauding had finally seen their true monstrous faces. The ultimate tragic victims of the terrible home invasion were suddenly fully exposed as the most ruthless, calculating frauds in the entire city. I stood quietly near the audiovisual cart, my dark tailored power suit acting as a flawless protective shield against the erupting chaos filling the room. I watched the angry mob of betrayed friends completely swarm the low stage, aggressively demanding their stolen dignity and their money back. I did not feel a single solitary drop of pity for the 4 people cowering defensively behind the podium. I had spent my entire adult life desperately trying to please them, shrinking myself down to fit into their cruel, rigid demands. They had gladly repaid my absolute loyalty by trying to completely ruin my life and force me onto the streets. Now their perfect, pristine masks were entirely shattered into a million tiny, unfixable pieces. Every single lie they had ever told was projected in bright, undeniable light for the whole world to see. They were completely exposed, entirely trapped by their own spectacular arrogance and facing the absolute unrestrained wrath of a deeply betrayed community. But as I watched the furious crowd effectively corner my trembling family, I knew the final crushing blow was still waiting just outside the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom. The public social destruction was incredibly beautiful to witness, but the brutal, inescapable federal justice was finally about to arrive. The collective outrage of the betrayed country club elite was a roaring physical force, but true panic only set in when the illusion of escape vanished. I stood perfectly still near the audiovisual cart, watching the exact moment the confident, arrogant facade melted completely off Brad's handsome face. The man who had sneered at me in my own hallway, who had callously plotted to steal millions and leave me drowning in toxic corporate debt, was suddenly nothing more than a terrified, cornered animal. His eyes darted wildly around the lavish ballroom, frantically calculating his odds of survival against a mob of furious, wealthy donors. He did not step in front of my sister to protect her. He did not offer a soothing word of comfort to the woman he had promised to marry. His self-preservation instincts brutally overrode his carefully rehearsed charm. He violently shoved a shocked elderly deacon out of his path and made a desperate dash for the heavy swinging doors that led directly into the country club kitchen. Brad was fast-moving with the sheer explosive adrenaline of a man who suddenly realized he was staring down the barrel of a lengthy federal prison sentence. He sprinted past the abandoned silent auction tables, knocking over a towering crystal vase of white roses in his blind rush for the exit. He reached out both hands to shove the padded kitchen doors open, absolutely certain he could slip out through the service alley and disappear into the crisp autumn night. But he never even made it across the threshold. The exact second, Brad's palm slammed against the padded leather. The heavy double doors violently exploded inward with a deafening crash. A massive tidal wave of dark tactical gear and bright yellow block lettering flooded directly into the grand ballroom. FBI agents and heavily armed inspectors from the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division stormed the opulent space from every single available entrance. They poured through the main foyer doors, the patio exits, and the kitchen service corridors, moving with a terrifying coordinated precision that instantly brought the chaotic room to a dead-chilling halt. Brad stumbled backward, his arms flailing uselessly in the air, but the federal agents did not give him a single fraction of a second to recover his balance. It was a cinematic, ruthless takedown. 3 massive agents in dark navy windbreakers converged on him simultaneously. One agent tackled him fiercely around the waist, while another grabbed his shoulders, driving him forcefully down into the polished hardwood floor. The heavy thud of his body hitting the ground echoed sharply through the cavernous room. A sleek silver tray of expensive champagne glasses shattered nearby as the officers expertly pinned his arms behind his back, snapping heavy steel handcuffs shut around his wrists. The smug, untouchable future son-in-law was reduced to a groaning, struggling mess, pinned beneath the heavy boots of federal law enforcement. The sheer overwhelming display of absolute government authority instantly silenced the furious mob of betrayed country club guests. The wealthy bankers and local politicians who had been shouting angry demands just seconds ago now stepped back in total stunned silence, pressing themselves tightly against the decorated dining tables to stay out of the way. I kept my posture rigid, watching the federal net finally snap shut around the very people who had deliberately planned my total financial destruction. A squad of IRS agents moved swiftly and decisively toward the elevated wooden stage, where my parents were still hopelessly trapped behind the crystal bowl overflowing with stolen charity donations. My father Richard, the exact man who had confidently commanded this room only minutes earlier, was paralyzed. His hands remained frozen in the air, his eyes wide with unadulterated shock, as federal officers briskly read him his Miranda rights and firmly secured his wrists. Sandra, however, refused to surrender her deeply ingrained theatrical instincts. Even as a female agent stepped onto the platform and reached for her arms, my mother tried to desperately maintain her fabricated victimhood. She began to weep frantically, looking around at her horrified church friends and aggressively insisting that this was all a terrible, devastating mistake. But her desperate lies fell on deaf ears. The agents ignored her frantic protests entirely, efficiently cuffing her hands and guiding her roughly down the carpeted stairs. The most spectacular collapse, however, belonged to my younger sister. Claire had spent her entire spoiled existence being fiercely protected, endlessly coddled and showered with every luxury our family could afford. She had never faced a single genuine consequence in her entire 26 years on this earth. When she saw Brad violently pinned to the floor and watched her invincible parents being paraded off the stage in steel handcuffs, her fragile reality completely imploded. Claire dropped hard onto her bare knees, right in the middle of the dance floor, the expensive fabric of her modest gray dress bunching up around her legs. She began to scream. It was not the delicate performative weeping she had practiced for the police detectives. It was a raw, hysterical, shrieking wail of pure, unfiltered terror. The golden child finally realized that her luxurious tropical future in Belize was permanently gone, and the terrifying prospect of a cold federal jail cell was staring her right in the face. In a frantic, desperate bid to save her own skin, Claire did exactly what selfish people always do when the ship begins to sink. She immediately violently turned on the very people who had enabled her entitlement. She pointed a shaking manic finger directly at my mother and father as they were being led past her, screaming at the top of her lungs that they had forced her to actively participate. She completely broke down and loudly wailed her innocence to the unyielding federal authorities. The perfect family bond I had deeply envied my entire life shattered right before my eyes into a miserable, tragic display of ultimate betrayal and absolute criminal ruin. The flashing lights of federal vehicles painted the pristine walls of the Oakwood Country Club in harsh strokes of crimson and blue. The chaotic screaming of the betrayed donors slowly faded into a stunned, heavy silence as the sheer magnitude of the law enforcement presence fully registered. Uniformed agents had completely secured every exit, blocking any remaining hope of escape. I stood perfectly still near the front of the ballroom, breathing in the cool air that suddenly tasted incredibly sweet. My father Richard was physically pressed against the polished wooden podium by two broad-shouldered agents. The commanding officer, a tall woman with steel-gray hair and a voice devoid of any sympathy, stepped directly in front of him. She pulled a laminated card from her pocket and began to read the Miranda rights. Her words cut through the suffocating tension in the room with absolute lethal precision. "You have the right to remain silent," she announced loudly, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." I watched my father visibly deflate. The incredibly arrogant man who had spent my entire life loudly dictating the strict rules of our household was suddenly entirely mute. The senior agent did not stop there. She loudly listed the official federal charges for the entire country club congregation to hear. She stated that Richard and Sandra Myers were being formally placed under arrest for severe bankruptcy fraud, deliberate tax evasion, and complex international money laundering. Each individual charge fell upon the silent crowd like a heavy physical blow. These were not minor accounting errors or simple misunderstandings. These were massive, devastating federal crimes, carrying decades of mandatory prison time. The cold, sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around my father's wrists was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the definitive sound of absolute justice finally arriving after decades of unchecked manipulation. The federal agents roughly patted him down, searching his tailored tuxedo jacket while his wealthy church friends watched in absolute unadulterated horror. The prominent local judge who had just handed my parents a thick envelope of cash stood completely frozen, his mouth hanging open in sheer disgust. My father could not even lift his head to look his former friends in the eye. He simply stared down at his expensive leather shoes, his face flushed with the darkest shade of absolute humiliation. His entire kingdom, built entirely on a rotten foundation of lies and deceit, was violently crumbling into dust right before his very eyes. Then the federal agents moved directly toward my mother. Sandra had finally stopped trying to maintain her delicate victim persona. The reality of the cold steel cuffs being aggressively fastened behind her back entirely shattered her fragile manufactured reality. The fake pristine tears she had been delicately dabbing away all evening were suddenly replaced by a torrent of genuine ugly sobbing. Her perfect salon-styled hair fell out of place, sticking to her damp cheeks, as her heavy designer makeup violently smeared around her eyes. She looked absolutely pathetic, stripped of her false elegance and exposed as the ruthless, greedy criminal she truly was. The officers gripped her arms, firmly preparing to march her straight down the center aisle of the ballroom, directly past the furious mob of people she had just ruthlessly scammed. As the agents began to physically march her toward the heavy double doors, my mother desperately, frantically scanned the crowd. Her manic, bloodshot eyes darted past the angry faces of the retired surgeon and Aunt Linda, completely ignoring their loud shouts of betrayal. Then her desperate, searching gaze finally locked onto me. I was standing tall and completely steady in my dark, tailored suit, watching her downfall with absolute cold clarity. The exact moment she saw me, a wild, frantic flicker of hope ignited in her eyes. She genuinely believed that after a lifetime of treating me like disposable garbage, she could still manipulate my deeply ingrained loyalty. She forcefully dug her expensive heels into the thick ballroom carpet, actively fighting the federal agents trying to pull her away. She violently twisted her upper body toward me, completely ignoring the officer's sharp commands to keep moving. "Sarah!" She screamed at the absolute top of her lungs, her voice cracking with pure terror. "Please, Sarah. You have to tell them, you have to stop this. They are making a terrible mistake. You are my daughter. You have to help me." I watched her thrash against the unyielding grip of the federal agents, crying genuine, desperate tears. This was the exact woman who had coldly orchestrated a massive criminal enterprise specifically designed to leave me drowning in millions of dollars of toxic corporate debt. This was the woman who had casually instructed her wealthy co-conspirators to let me take the devastating fall so she could sip expensive cocktails on a private beach in Belize. And now, in her moment of ultimate defeat, she dared to weaponize the very concept of family she had spent my entire life destroying. I did not flinch, and I did not look away. I stepped slowly forward, closing the distance between us until I was standing just a few feet away from the woman who had given birth to me. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting to see if the discarded sacrificial lamb would actually attempt to save her monstrous parents. I looked my mother dead in her smeared, panicked eyes. My voice was incredibly calm, carrying no anger, no sorrow, and absolutely no mercy. "You told me I was not part of this family anymore," I replied loudly, ensuring my words echoed clearly through the silent room. "Enjoy Belize behind bars." The absolute finality of my statement struck her like a physical blow to the chest. Her frantic struggling completely ceased. She slumped forward, her shoulders shaking uncontrollably as the federal agents finally pulled her away, marching her directly out the heavy wooden doors and into the flashing lights of the waiting transport vehicles. The heavy mahogany doors of the federal courthouse in downtown Seattle felt entirely different than the grand entrance of the Oakwood Country Club. 6 exhausting months had passed since that chaotic night of shattered crystal and flashing police lights. The crisp autumn air had slowly surrendered to a long, bitter winter, and finally melted into the pale, hopeful light of early spring. I walked through the security checkpoints and echoing marble corridors with a quiet, steady rhythm. The suffocating terror that had once dictated my every waking moment was completely gone. In its place was a solid, unshakable resolve. The federal justice system moves with a painfully slow and methodical grind, but it is absolutely relentless once the trap is sprung. Today was the final sentencing hearing. I sat in the front row of the gallery, watching the heavy wooden door beside the judge's bench swing open. My parents walked into the sterile room first. They were completely stripped of their expensive tailored suits and designer silk dresses. Instead, they wore oversized, shapeless orange jumpsuits. The visual transformation was absolutely staggering. My father, Richard, the man who had always commanded every room he entered with booming, arrogant authority, looked incredibly small and frail. His silver hair was thinning and unkempt. The false bravado that had fueled his entire life had completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a hollow, terrified old man. My mother, Sandra, shuffled closely behind him. Her wrists were securely chained to a heavy leather belt around her waist. Without her regular salon appointments and expensive cosmetic routines, she had seemingly aged 2 decades in a matter of months. She kept her eyes glued to the polished linoleum floor, refusing to look anywhere near the gallery where I was sitting. The federal judge presiding over the case was a stern, uncompromising woman who absolutely despised corporate criminals. She did not mince words when addressing my parents. She looked down from her elevated bench and methodically outlined the staggering scope of their absolute greed. She thoroughly condemned their elaborate plot to stage a violent home invasion, manipulate the federal bankruptcy courts, and systematically launder $5 million through international shell companies. But she reserved her harshest criticism for their absolute willingness to completely destroy their own daughter's financial future just to secure their luxurious tropical retirement. She brought the heavy wooden gavel down with a resounding crack, sentencing Richard and Sandra Myers to 10 long consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. There is no early parole in the federal system. They will spend the rest of their viable adult lives staring at concrete walls. Brad was brought into the courtroom next. The smug, slick commercial developer who had casually plotted to ruin my life while sipping expensive champagne in my father's private study was utterly unrecognizable. He had desperately tried to mount a robust legal defense, burning through hundreds of thousands of dollars in retained counsel, trying to shift the entire blame onto my parents. But the cloned digital ledgers and the perfectly preserved audio recordings I had provided to the Internal Revenue Service were absolutely bulletproof. The criminal investigators had easily traced every single offshore wire transfer directly back to his personal internet address. The judge highlighted his specific role as the primary financial architect of the entire money laundering scheme. Because of his extensive background in commercial real estate and his deliberate manipulation of global banking protocols, the court handed him an even harsher punishment. Brad was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. His handsome, arrogant face crumbled completely as the armed bailiffs grabbed his arms and marched him out the side door. He let out a loud, pathetic sob that echoed pitifully through the quiet courtroom. The most spectacular and absolute betrayal, however, came directly from my precious younger sister. Claire did not even attempt to stand by the man she had promised to marry, or the parents who had worshipped the ground she walked on since birth. The very second the federal agents had placed her in a cold interrogation room on the night of the gala, she had immediately turned into a singing canary. She took a massive comprehensive plea deal, turning state's evidence and eagerly testifying against our parents and her fiancé in exchange for leniency. She provided the federal prosecutors with every missing password, every hidden safety deposit box location, and every single detail of their tropical escape plan. Even with her total cooperation, the severity of the wire fraud and international tax evasion charges meant she could not completely escape the consequences of her immense greed. The judge accepted her aggressive plea arrangement, sentencing the former golden child to 5 years in a minimum security facility. The perfect, flawless family unit had violently imploded, turning into a pack of starving wolves the moment the ship started sinking. With the criminal sentences officially handed down, and the masterminds locked safely behind thick iron bars, I had one final personal battle to fight. The civil court proceedings took place in a different building just 2 blocks away. I sat beside Attorney Davis, my incredibly brilliant legal lifesaver, as the bankruptcy judge reviewed my specific case file. The atmosphere in this room was significantly lighter, almost triumphant. The judge carefully examined the verified reports from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the federal prosecutors officially confirming that my signature on the $2 million commercial loan had been obtained under extreme duress and deliberate fraudulent pretenses. I listened with a pounding heart as the judge officially annulled the toxic bankruptcy filing that had been suffocating me for months. He struck the massive fraudulent debt entirely from my permanent legal record. The court formally and publicly recognized me as a verified victim of severe financial fraud, clearing my name completely of any associated wrongdoing. The heavy, agonizing $2 million boulder that my parents had maliciously chained to my neck was instantly severed. I felt a massive physical rush of air fill my lungs. I was entirely, completely debt-free. My credit score would be fully restored and my hard-earned professional license was completely safe. I walked out of the heavy glass doors of the courthouse and stepped directly into the bright, warm afternoon sun. The brutal, bitter storm was finally over and the rest of my life was waiting. The morning sun streaming through my kitchen window felt entirely different these days. It no longer carried the heavy, dreadful weight of impending doom or the terrifying threat of imminent foreclosure. Instead, the warm golden light illuminated a quiet life that was finally completely and undeniably my own. 6 months had passed since the federal judge slammed her gavel down and obliterated the massive fraudulent debt my parents had maliciously chained to my name. I was already breathing much easier knowing my personal credit was fully restored and my professional license was totally safe. But the universe had one final incredible surprise waiting for me in the morning mail. Arthur Davis. My brilliant and relentless attorney had quietly filed a massive stack of complex paperwork on my behalf right after we initially handed the cloned hard drive over to the federal agents. He had officially applied for the Internal Revenue Service whistleblower program in my name. I had completely forgotten about the application in the chaotic, sprawling aftermath of the arrests and the subsequent criminal trials. The federal government takes international tax evasion and large-scale bankruptcy fraud incredibly seriously. Because my pristine forensic accounting work had directly led to the successful recovery of the stolen $5 million hiding in the Cayman Islands, the law dictated that I was legally entitled to a percentage of the seized assets. I sat at my small kitchen table staring at the official Treasury Department letter with absolutely wide, unblinking eyes. The federal government had officially awarded me 20% of the recovered offshore funds. It was a completely clean, entirely tax-free sum of exactly $1 million. My hands shook violently as I read the numbers printed boldly across the crisp, white paper. For a full decade, I had scraped by on clearance rack groceries and cheap thrift store sweaters, constantly draining my own meager savings to support the very people who eventually tried to destroy me. Now I was holding a formal piece of paper that represented absolute total financial freedom. The very first thing I did when the massive wire transfer finally cleared into my personal checking account was drive straight to the local bank branch that held my original mortgage. I walked right up to the bank manager's desk and requested a complete payoff statement for my modest suburban home. I wrote a single check to cover the entire remaining balance of the property. The bank manager looked at me with immense surprise as he stamped the heavy paperwork completely paid in full. Walking out of that bank building, I felt a physical, literal weight lift completely off my shoulders. The house that my parents had callously tried to let the commercial bank repossess was now absolutely mine. No one could ever threaten to throw me out onto the cold street ever again. The second thing I did was drive directly to the towering glass office building where I had worked as an exhausted, underpaid corporate auditor for 7 long, grueling years. I walked straight into the Human Resources Department and politely handed them my formal written letter of resignation. I did not give a standard 2 weeks' notice or offer any fake apologies. I simply packed up my desk, thanked my stunned colleagues for their time, and walked out the sliding glass doors with my head held high. I was entirely done spending my precious life making wealthy, faceless corporations even richer, while completely ignoring my own dreams and true potential. With my home fully paid off and a substantial financial cushion safely secured in the bank, I finally took the terrifying, beautiful leap I had always been far too scared to take. I leased a bright, beautiful office space in a historic brick building downtown. I bought solid mahogany desks, comfortable leather chairs, and top-of-the-line forensic auditing software. I officially opened the doors to my very own boutique financial investigation firm. I did not want to work for massive wealthy clients anymore. I exclusively dedicated my new professional practice to helping vulnerable individuals who had been financially abused, neglected, or deliberately defrauded by their own trusted family members and domestic partners. Within 3 short months, my client roster was completely full. I sat across from devastated wives whose husbands had secretly hidden assets in complex offshore accounts. I worked closely with elderly parents whose greedy, entitled children had quietly drained their retirement funds. I used my unique personal experience and my razor-sharp accounting skills to relentlessly track down every single stolen penny. Seeing the profound relief wash over my clients' faces when I handed them the undeniable proof they needed to reclaim their stolen lives was the greatest emotional reward I could ever possibly imagine. I was actively taking the worst, most traumatic experience of my entire life and transforming it into a powerful weapon to protect the innocent. My life today is incredibly peaceful and wonderfully quiet. I spend my weekends gardening in my backyard, reading thick novels on my sunlit porch, and drinking expensive coffee without feeling a single ounce of guilt. I have completely cut off all contact with the extended family members who had quickly rushed to defend my parents' terrible actions. I have surrounded myself with a small, tight-knit group of genuine friends who value me for my character rather than my financial utility. The bitter, terrified, sacrificial lamb who had constantly begged for crumbs of maternal affection is entirely gone. In her place stands a fierce, independent woman who knows her own absolute worth and fiercely guards her own boundaries. Blind family loyalty is often just a tool for exploitation. Do not ever set yourself on fire to keep ungrateful people warm. Setting boundaries is not a betrayal, it is survival. You do not owe your sanity, your health, or your financial security to people who only view you as a convenient resource to be used and discarded. If you found justice in my story, please hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is. I absolutely love reading your responses and connecting with all of you. Protect yourselves out there, and I will see you in the next story.